Artemidorus of Daldis once expressed a belief that many people in the Roman world would have recognized immediately. Just as the heavens belong to the gods, Italy, in his view, belonged to kings. That idea was not simply poetic. For a long time, it matched political reality. The center of imperial life still lay in Rome and in the most desirable parts of Italy. Much as power had once gathered around the houses and country estates of the great men of the late Republic. Even after the empire had expanded across vast distances, the emperor still returned to Rome to perform the great public rituals of rule. He came back to meet the Senate, preside over spectacles, speak before the people, and distribute gifts that reminded the population that imperial generosity was part of the order of the state. When Marcus Aurelius returned after years away, the crowd's response showed exactly what Rome still meant. The city remained the stage on which imperial authority had to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. That remained true for centuries. Even when emperors spent more and more time away from the capital, Rome continued to serve as the ceremonial heart of the empire. Major anniversaries, victories, and dynastic celebrations still drew rulers back there. Yet this creates an important question about the nature of emperorship itself. The Roman emperor did not emerge out of nowhere. The office grew out of older republican traditions, and many of its habits were shaped by institutions that had once belonged to magistrates and senators rather than monarchs. In the Republic, officials had no special state palaces from which to govern. Public business happened in open civic spaces such as the Senate House, the Forum, and the Campus Martius. But the social side of political life unfolded in private homes. It was there that powerful men received visitors in the morning, built networks of obligation, and displayed rank through the crowds that accompanied them through the city. Ambassadors and petitioners did not always approach the Roman state through official chambers. They often went directly to the houses of influential men, seeking support through personal access. That older world mattered because the imperial office inherited many of its social habits. A large part of imperial government developed not in a purpose-built royal institution, but inside what had originally been a private household. That fact shaped the character of Roman monarchy from the beginning. It meant that the emperor's role was never entirely separated from the domestic setting of elite Roman life. The physical design of the great senatorial house, with its vestibules, courtyards, reception areas, and gardens, created a framework in which political authority could be exercised without yet becoming fully detached from aristocratic tradition. This helps explain why Roman monarchy evolved so gradually. The emperor stood above other men, but the environment in which he ruled often still resembled the world of the senator. The same tension appeared in another familiar feature of elite life, the villa. A Roman aristocrat was expected to divide his time between the city and the countryside. Away from Rome, he supervised estates, hunted, entertained, read, and enjoyed the cultivated beauty of gardens, sculpture, and carefully designed landscapes. The wealthiest men moved between several residences in Latium and Campania, living a rhythm of seasonal retreat that had become part of upper-class identity. The emperors continued this pattern for centuries. As long as the imperial centre remained rooted in Italy, rulers spent long stretches of time in villas near Rome, along the Campanian coast, or in other favoured resorts. These residences were not merely luxurious escapes, they were places where government continued. Emperors heard legal cases, answered embassies, issued letters, and made decisions while surrounded by the comforts of aristocratic country life. Even when later imperial power shifted eastward, traces of this older pattern remained. These villas therefore mattered far beyond architecture or social prestige. They reveal something essential about the nature of Roman rule. An emperor could govern not only from the formal spaces of Rome, but also from seaside retreats and inland country estates. Septimius Severus, for example, is described as spending much of his time in imperial villas outside Rome and on the Campanian coast, while continuing to judge cases and manage political affairs. That detail is revealing. It means the emperor's work was portable. It did not require a rigidly fixed court in the later sense. Authority could travel with the ruler and settle temporarily wherever he chose to stay. That flexibility was one of the defining strengths of Roman emperorship. Imperial travel through the provinces reflects the same pattern from another angle. In some ways, the closest republican model for imperial rule was not the life of a magistrate in Rome, but that of a provincial governor. Away from the city, a Roman governor already lived in a manner that resembled monarchy. He commanded troops, received embassies, judged disputes, negotiated with kings, and moved with a personal entourage made up of slaves, freedmen, clerks, and trusted companions. In the Greek world especially, such a governor entered landscapes still shaped by memories of Hellenistic kingship. The language, rituals, and expectations surrounding power had long monarchical associations. Roman officials could easily slip into roles that looked royal, even before Rome formally accepted monarchy. The governor's residence in a province, whether a palace, headquarters, or commandeered elite house, provided a setting where Roman rule appeared deeply personal. Greek cities approached powerful Romans much as they had once approached kings. They sent embassies, offered honours, negotiated directly, and tried to secure favour through personal relationships. Even rebellions reflected this overlap between Roman and royal models of authority. When leaders of revolts attempted to imitate power, they borrowed from both traditions at once. They created councils, staged public audiences, dressed in symbolic garments, and surrounded themselves with attendants and insignia. Such behaviour shows how easily the image of Roman command could merge with the image of kingship. In that sense, monarchy in Rome can be understood partly as the transfer into the capital of the habits and powers that a Roman governor had once exercised in the provinces. The emperor brought into Rome what had previously belonged to military and provincial command on the empire's edges. This change had profound consequences. It gradually isolated the ruler from the collective institutions of the republic, and loosened his dependence on the city's older civic framework. The dictator Julius Caesar offered an early glimpse of this development. His concentration of power was so striking that contemporaries could already speak as if Rome itself had fallen under the domination usually associated with subjects in the provinces. That reaction captures the deeper transformation underway. The ruler of Rome was becoming someone more distant, more permanent, and more difficult to absorb into the old language of magistracies. To understand the emperor fully, it is therefore not enough to define his legal powers. His role was shaped by the places in which he lived and the social patterns through which he dealt with others. Rome, Italy, and the provinces all provided settings in which imperial authority took different forms. The emperor could appear as magistrate, host, judge, patron, commander, or monarch depending on the scene. His residence in Rome was one kind of political theatre. His villas in Italy were another. His journeys through the provinces created yet another, one that exposed entire populations to the living presence of imperial power. In Republican Rome, a man's house had always mattered politically. A leading senator's residence was not simply private property. It was part of his public identity. Size, location, and architectural splendour all signalled rank. Great men needed houses large enough to receive streams of visitors, clients, allies, petitioners, and fellow aristocrats. Their homes might contain libraries, galleries and halls grand enough to rival public buildings, because important consultations, legal settlements, and political conversations often took place there. The Roman upper class did not draw a sharp line between public and private life. A noble household was itself a political institution. Location added to this meaning. Houses near the Forum or on the Palatine Hill carried exceptional prestige because they were close to the spaces where public life unfolded. Easy access meant easier attendance by clients and supporters. A prominent house on the Palatine could turn its owner into a visible figure within the daily life of the capital. This elite environment, full of grand residences and private gardens, became the setting in which the main imperial residence first took shape. That development was not inevitable. Julius Caesar, in his role as chief priest, had enjoyed one of the rare official residences attached to a Roman office. But Augustus did not build his identity around that precedent. By the time he later gained the priesthood, his position on the Palatine was already established. Instead of shifting to an older official house, he strengthened the symbolic connection between emperor and Palatine. In doing so, he helped define a new center of power. His own house, originally belonging to a private aristocrat, became gradually transformed into something more than a distinguished residence. It became the nucleus of an imperial home. This change happened with remarkable speed. Augustus had first lived in a family house and then in another residence near the Forum. Later, he moved to a house on the Palatine that had belonged to Hortensius. By later standards, it was not especially extravagant, but its political value soon increased. After victory over Sextus Pompey, Augustus acquired neighbouring properties and announced plans for a temple of Apollo with surrounding porticos. When completed, this complex became central to both court life and public business. The temple precinct and its library were used for official meetings and state functions. Senators met there. Judicial and administrative work was conducted there. Audiences were held there. The religious monument and the private residence had become inseparable parts of one political world. At the same time, the house itself gained symbols that marked it out as extraordinary. Honours were attached to its doorway. Public inscriptions celebrated the ruler in its entrance space. Even language began to change. The name of the hill itself started to become the name of the emperor's residence. Over time, the Palatine ceased to mean only a place in Rome and came to signify the imperial household as an institution. Poets of the age already used the word in that sense. The shift in vocabulary reveals a deeper shift in political culture. A private house had become the recognized center of the empire. Even so, the imperial residence never lost all memory of its aristocratic origins. It remained a complex of structures added over time. Not a single palace conceived from the start as the fixed seat of monarchy. Members of the imperial family occupied different sections. New buildings were attached to old ones. Some emperors expanded the complex dramatically. Others altered its relation to the city itself. Gaius temporarily turned the Temple of Castor and Pollux into a kind of entrance hall, opening onto the Forum. Nero later created an immense pleasure complex that spread across the heart of Rome. Domitian built a vast palace on the Palatine, whose surviving remains suggest a revolution in scale and form, yet still leave many details of its actual social use uncertain. What does remain clear is that access, reception, and waiting were central features of palace life. People gathered at the entrance to await the emperor's morning greeting. Learned men conversed there while they waited to be admitted. Embassies crowded the approaches. Petitions could be presented in these settings. This continuity matters. Even as imperial architecture grew more monumental, older Roman practices survived inside it. The emperor still received people in ways that echoed the salutations of aristocratic life. Monarchy did not erase those forms. It absorbed them. The Palatine was not the only setting for imperial life in Rome. Emperors also used houses and gardens elsewhere in the city. Many of them inherited, confiscated, or acquired through other means. These estates could be luxurious, politically charged, and fully capable of hosting official business. Gaius used the gardens associated with his mother on the right bank of the Tiber. He received delegations there and turned leisure spaces into scenes of terror and spectacle. He also spent time in the great gardens on the Esquiline, where audiences could be interrupted by his inspection of lavish buildings and furnishings. The image is telling. The emperor's work remained woven into the life of a wealthy Roman aristocrat, with all its elegance, display, and unpredictability. Other gardens also served as imperial residences. Some were famous for their refinement and historic associations. The gardens of Sallust became especially important. Vespasian used them as part of his effort to project simplicity and openness after the excesses of earlier rulers. He received visitors there readily and seemed more accessible than his predecessors. Nerva died there. Later emperors were said to favour them as well. Even in the age of Maxentius, these gardens still mattered enough to be mentioned as one of the settings of imperial life. This variety is significant. The emperor in Rome did not inhabit a single rigid palace world. He moved among residences with different histories and atmospheres, all of them rooted in the tradition of elite urban housing. Beyond Rome, Italy offered another landscape of imperial rule. The emperors inherited not only the estates, but also the habits of the late Republican aristocracy. The Bay of Naples, the coast of Latium, Tibur, Praeneste, Lanuvium, Antium, Alba, and other favoured places had long been the retreats of the rich. Emperors followed the same pattern, turning these sites into extensions of government. Augustus used villas in several of these places and was known to give judgments while staying in them. Capri became the most famous example when Tiberius withdrew there for the final decade of his reign. His retreat altered the public image of imperial government. Yet it did not mean abdication. Major affairs still passed through his hands. The emperor could remain remote and yet continue to rule. At Tiber, Hadrian created a residence on an enormous scale, spread across a landscape of buildings, gardens, and waterworks. Yet even there, for all its grandeur, there is little sign that special architectural forms were required for government. The emperor did what emperors usually did. He answered embassies, made decisions, and conducted affairs from within the setting of an elegant villa. At Alba, Domitian went further, and for a time made his estate into an alternative seat of rule. Crowds waited outside. His council met there. Legal cases were heard there. Priests were summoned there. An imperial villa could become, in effect, a temporary capital. Other places served similar purposes at different times. Antium remained important across several reigns. Trajan wrote letters from there and answered Greek communities while staying on the coast. Baiae, long famous for luxury, also continued to function as a place where emperors lived, ruled, and died. In the Antonine period, more northerly sites such as Centum Cellae, Alsium, and Laurium came into prominence. There, the blend of leisure and government becomes especially vivid. Pliny describes evenings of conversation, moderate dinners, entertainment, and gifts, all framed by daytime legal work in the emperor's council. Fronto complains that Marcus Aurelius, supposedly enjoying a holiday, spent his nights on judicial business. Even relaxation became administrative labour. Campania, nevertheless, remained one of the strongest magnets of imperial life. Emperors continued to write letters and conduct business from cities and villas there. Cassius Dio's account of time spent with Severus Alexander in Rome and Campania shows how natural it remained for an emperor to move between the capital and the great retreats of southern Italy. In the case of Vespasian, attachment to the countryside becomes especially revealing. Near the end of his life, while weakened by illness, he still continued to receive embassies and perform imperial duties from his bed. The scene is both personal and political. Even at death, the emperor remained a working ruler, and the setting was not a formal palace, but a country estate. By the 3rd century, these villas become less visible in the evidence. Partly this is because the surviving sources grow thinner, but partly it reflects a real change. Military pressures, frontier wars, and civil conflict forced emperors to spend more time in the provinces. The rhythm of rule shifted outward. Yet this new mobility was not entirely new. It had roots in the earlier journeys of the first 2 centuries, and, deeper still, in the world of republican provincial command. A governor in the Republic was always on the move. He marched with armies, toured cities, settled disputes, and met local elites. His arrival placed heavy burdens on the communities through which he passed. Cities had to organize supplies, lodging, transport, and ceremonial welcomes. At the same time, these visits opened opportunities. Local leaders might win favor, secure influence, or establish personal ties that could matter greatly later. Every arrival was therefore charged with uncertainty. Too little respect could be dangerous. Too much might be expensive. Roman power on the move forced subjects to guess what would satisfy it. Roman officials expected to be escorted, greeted, and honoured in public. Crowds turned out to meet them on departure and return. Towns prepared formal receptions. In politically tense moments, the scale of such welcome could signal real loyalties. Even private travel by a prominent Roman could trigger elaborate ceremony. The boundaries between public office, social standing, and personal prestige were never entirely clear. The same was true of practical demands. Magistrates and governors expected transport, lodging, and supplies. Some tried to restrain these burdens. Others extended them. Laws attempted to regulate what could be demanded, but the very existence of such laws shows how persistent the problem was. Along the road, an official might sleep in an assigned residence, a public guest house, or the home of a local notable. Private hospitality was especially important. A host's choice of food, comfort, and deference could strengthen or damage a relationship. The entire journey operated through this unstable mixture of obligation and favour. Governors also held morning receptions in the provinces, just as they did at Rome. They were met by embassies even before entering their assigned territories. Petitioners followed them from place to place, hoping proximity would bring results. In a world where access to power often mattered as much as formal procedure, travel created political possibilities. When monarchy was established, all these features of provincial travel reappeared on a grander scale around the emperor. The ruler on the move became the most immediate face of the empire. During journeys, he was more exposed than usual to petitions from individuals, communities, and embassies. His presence could suddenly impose immense demands on a local population. Whether in hospitality, transport, or ceremonial display. At the same time, mobile rulership made possible the later development of new centres of power beyond Rome. Long before Constantinople became an imperial capital, the habits of emperors travelling, halting, judging, receiving, and ruling wherever they happened to be had already prepared the way. The empire's political centre could move because imperial authority had never been tied completely to one building or one city. It had always lived within a person, his household, his entourage, and the places through which he passed. An emperor moving through the provinces was never a quiet or ordinary event. His presence alone could transform daily life for entire regions. The impact was so great that even strict religious rules were sometimes set aside in order to see him. Traditions that normally forbade certain actions could be temporarily relaxed if they stood in the way of appearing before the ruler during an imperial visit. Such exceptions reveal how powerful the attraction of imperial authority was. Every arrival followed a recognizable pattern. Ceremonies accompanied the departure from one city and the entrance into the next. Local elites gathered outside city gates to greet the ruler, offering formal salutations before escorting him inside. Reliefs carved on monuments from the late Roman world capture these scenes. The emperor leaving one place and entering another, greeted by dignitaries who stand waiting beyond the walls. Participation in these ceremonies was not entirely voluntary. Cities were expected to turn out in full force. Stories circulated of individuals who tried to avoid these obligations and paid a heavy price. One account tells of a poet who failed to appear when an emperor entered his city. While others rushed to greet the imperial procession, he remained at home devoted to philosophical reflection. His absence was taken as an insult, and he was reportedly punished with exile. Descriptions of imperial journeys from late Roman speeches provide vivid impressions of the excitement surrounding these visits. When two emperors travelled through northern Italy toward a meeting in Milan, crowds poured into the countryside to catch sight of them. Farmers left their fields, villagers gathered along the roads, and animals wandered freely as people rushed to watch the procession. Altars were lit, incense burned, and sacrifices were offered as if the arrival of the emperor carried sacred significance. Another speech describes the reception of an emperor in the Gallic city of Actium. Citizens streamed in from surrounding fields while the streets inside the city were decorated with banners belonging to professional associations. Images of local gods were placed along the route, and musicians were stationed at intervals to accompany the procession. Because there were not enough performers to cover the entire route, the same bands moved quickly from one location to another in order to greet the emperor repeatedly as he advanced through the streets. The ruler himself was portrayed as approachable, allowing people to present their requests and speak with him directly. Behind these scenes of enthusiasm stood months of preparation. Cities often began organizing supplies long before the imperial arrival. Sometimes these preparations proved unnecessary if the emperor changed his plans, but local officials had little choice except to prepare for the possibility. One unfortunate provincial governor was punished simply for using facilities that had been prepared in anticipation of an imperial visit that never happened. Occasionally, these visits created opportunities for extraordinary displays of loyalty. A famous example describes a local king who welcomed the future Augustus with lavish hospitality. He entertained the emperor and his entire army, supplied provisions for their long journey across difficult terrain, and personally escorted them on part of their route. Such generosity could strengthen political alliances and secure imperial favour. More often, however, the arrival of the emperor brought heavy burdens. Even imperial authorities recognized how disruptive these journeys could be. One imperial letter admits that enormous demands were placed on provincial communities in order to support official travel. Even a relatively modest journey required pack animals, food supplies, lodging, and transport. Providing these necessities required intense effort from local populations. Evidence from administrative records confirms the scale of these preparations. Officials sometimes gathered vehicles and supplies across entire regions in anticipation of imperial travel. In certain cases, detailed announcements were issued in advance describing the expected route. These notices listed the places where the emperor would stop, the stations where animals and provisions would be provided, and the camps where the imperial party would rest along the way. Along the major roads of the empire stood official stopping places where travellers could rest. These stations form part of a wider transportation network that connected distant provinces. Documents from Egypt mention deliveries of food and other supplies to these stations when an imperial visit was expected. These records provide a rare glimpse into the logistical machinery required to sustain the movement of the imperial court. Not everyone welcomed the emperor's journeys. One historian who witnessed the travels of a particularly demanding ruler complained that communities were forced to construct expensive lodgings at their own cost. Buildings were erected along the route in preparation for the emperor's arrival, yet in many cases he never even used them. Entire amphitheatres and racetracks were sometimes built simply because the ruler might choose to spend time in a particular location. Another account describes the enormous preparations required for a planned imperial voyage along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Local authorities anticipated the arrival of large crowds accompanying the emperor. Officials, soldiers, sailors, and servants would all travel together with the imperial household. Cities were expected to supply food not only for basic needs, but also for the extravagant tastes of the ruler. Inscriptions from provincial cities confirm the responsibilities placed upon local administrators. One official in the Syrian city of Palmyra was praised for organizing food supplies for both residents and visiting travelers during an imperial visit. He also supervised the reception of soldiers who accompanied the emperor. Military expeditions created even greater pressure. When emperors moved eastward with armies, entire regions had to support their passage. Cities along major routes toward the eastern frontier were repeatedly responsible for supplying troops and providing logistical support. Some inscriptions honor individuals who organized provisions for imperial armies moving toward the frontiers of Syria. Documents preserved on papyrus offer particularly detailed evidence. In Egypt, administrative correspondence records the storage of large quantities of supplies in preparation for an imperial visit. These included barley, hay, pigs, sheep, oil, and other provisions necessary to sustain both soldiers and animals. Another letter from a provincial official requested detailed reports on wine production, livestock numbers, and other resources so that the imperial household could be properly supplied. The letter makes clear that the costs of these preparations were tracked carefully by the imperial treasury. Personal stories also survive. In one village, a woman reported that 2 of her camels had been requisitioned for an imperial visit. The animals were eventually returned, but one was no longer fit for work. The remaining camel was soon taken again, this time to support military operations in Syria. Other documents show local fishermen promising to deliver fish products for the emperor's expected arrival. Even everyday items such as fish sauce and salted fish became part of the logistical system supporting imperial travel. Among the most revealing records is a collection of letters from a provincial administrator in Upper Egypt written during preparations for an imperial journey. The official repeatedly instructed city authorities to appoint supervisors responsible for gathering supplies. At the same time, he wrote anxious reports to higher officials explaining that these instructions had not been carried out properly. One letter describes the urgent need to repair ships that would carry the emperor along the Nile. The administrator ordered the local council to appoint inspectors and financial overseers to ensure the work was completed honestly and efficiently. Yet the city authorities responded with open resistance, arguing that their community should not be burdened with such demands. The letter captures the tension between imperial expectations and local realities. Imperial movement, therefore, represented far more than a ceremonial procession. It was a major social and economic event that reshaped local life wherever it occurred. The experience varied greatly depending on the personality of the emperor. One ruler travelled slowly and extravagantly toward Rome after being proclaimed emperor by his troops. Cities along the route were nearly ruined by the lavish banquets required to entertain him. Even river crossings were transformed into spectacles, with luxurious boats prepared for the imperial party. Gladiatorial games were organised in advance to celebrate his arrival. Other emperors took the opposite approach. One famously refused to travel through the provinces at all, believing that the presence of the imperial court inevitably imposed hardships on local populations. Even the most careful ruler, he argued, would still burden the communities he visited. Observers in the Roman world often compared different emperors based on how they travelled. Some rulers moved with restraint, sharing the same accommodations and provisions as ordinary officials. Others left devastation in their wake through excessive demands. Despite the burdens involved, imperial visits carried undeniable advantages for provincial cities. Ceremonies and sacrifices frequently accompanied the emperor's arrival. Public spectacles such as games and contests might be organised in his honour. Sometimes, the emperor himself sponsored these entertainments. At other times, cities arranged them as demonstrations of loyalty. In Greek cities especially, imperial visits often included intellectual and cultural performances. Sophists delivered speeches before the emperor, poets presented compositions celebrating his achievements, and local youths performed hymns in his honour. In some cases, emperors visited famous monuments, or engaged in debates with scholars. These visits could leave lasting marks on civic identity. Some cities began counting years from the date of the emperor's presence. Others created festivals commemorating the occasion. The prestige of hosting the emperor was immense. A later writer illustrated this prestige with a vivid comparison. A city that hosted an emperor, he suggested, resembled a town where a great king had taken residence in a single house. That one dwelling transformed the entire city. Enemies and bandits would no longer threaten it, because the presence of the ruler conferred honour and protection upon the whole community. Beyond symbolic prestige, imperial visits also created practical opportunities. When the emperor travelled, he became far more accessible than when he remained in the capital. Individuals could approach him with petitions and legal appeals. Communities could present requests directly to the highest authority in the empire. Some emperors tried to prevent this flood of requests. One ruler even issued orders, forbidding people from approaching him during his journey, and had roads cleared to prevent petitioners from stopping his procession. Another emperor suspected that a servant had deliberately slowed his travel to allow a litigant to reach him along the road. Prominent individuals often used imperial visits to advance their careers. Inscriptions record citizens who received special honours after appearing before the emperor during his travels. Some obtained privileges or prestigious clothing associated with official positions. Cities themselves also sought advantages. When an emperor visited, communities frequently presented petitions asking for privileges, financial aid, or public works. Sometimes these requests were successful. In other cases, the emperor refused, even after dramatic public appeals. Speeches delivered before emperors occasionally included direct requests for assistance. An orator addressing Constantine once urged him to visit his city and restore its buildings through imperial generosity. Such appeals reflected a widely held expectation that the emperor's presence might bring tangible benefits. Cities located along imperial travel routes, therefore, enjoyed unique opportunities. Local disputes could be brought directly before the ruler. In one case, a religious conflict from a village near Damascus was presented to the emperor while he was staying in Antioch. The participants bypassed normal provincial authorities and appealed directly to imperial judgment. Even more remarkable was the fact that embassies travelled from distant parts of the empire to meet the emperor wherever he happened to be. Delegations followed him across provinces, seeking decisions or favours. Cities sent representatives not only to Rome, but also to frontier regions or military headquarters where the emperor resided. Examples of this pattern appear throughout imperial history. Delegations visited Augustus while he was travelling in Spain. Others travelled across great distances to meet emperors stationed in Northern Europe or Britain. Legal decisions issued by emperors could then travel back across the empire to be delivered months later in distant provinces. This constant movement meant that the emperor himself effectively became a travelling centre of government. Wherever he went, the machinery of imperial administration followed. Officials, soldiers, petitioners, and diplomats gathered around him, turning his temporary residence into the political heart of the empire. By the 3rd century, this mobile form of rule had become increasingly common. Legal writers even assumed that the emperor's court might be located anywhere. Certain punishments prohibited individuals not only from entering Rome, but also from residing in any city where the emperor happened to be staying or passing through. During the reign of Licinius, historical sources offer only limited insight into the details of his rule. Yet one city, Nicomedia, played a role that reached beyond politics and into the life of the Christian church itself. Its importance drew ambitious figures seeking influence close to the imperial court. One such man was Eusebius, originally bishop of Berytus, who transferred himself to the bishopric of Nicomedia in hopes of gaining greater political standing near the emperor. Occasional glimpses allow us to imagine life around the imperial residence there. One story tells of Arsacius, a soldier responsible for caring for the emperor's lions. During a short period of persecution against Christians in the early 4th century, he openly professed his faith, abandoned military service, and withdrew into a tower near Nicomedia to live in quiet devotion. Another account describes an incident involving Augustus, who would later become Bishop of Mopsuestia. At the time, he served in the imperial administration as a notary. In the palace courtyard stood a fountain beside a statue of Dionysus, shaded by a vine. Licinius often came there to relax with members of his court. One day, he asked Augustus to pick a cluster of grapes from the vine. After Augustus did so, the emperor instructed him to place the grapes at the feet of the statue as an offering. Augustus refused. Rather than comply with what he saw as an act of pagan worship, he withdrew from imperial service altogether. For nearly 3 decades before Constantine defeated Licinius, an imperial court had already been operating in this Greek city close to the Bosporus. Meanwhile, Rome remained the seat of power for Maxentius during the early 4th century. Constantine himself spent little time there, moving instead between cities such as Milan, Trier, Sirmium, Serdica, and later Thessalonica. Looking back, it becomes clear that these developments gradually prepared the way for a decisive transformation that was soon to occur. That transformation became possible only after Constantine's victory over Licinius in September of the year 324 at Chrysopolis, across the strait from the ancient city of Byzantium. The founding of Constantinople did not appear suddenly out of nowhere. It was the result of a long historical process. Since the earliest days of the Roman Empire, emperors had often governed far from Rome itself. Many rulers had chosen to spend extended periods elsewhere, sometimes out of necessity and sometimes out of preference. By the early 4th century, the centre of imperial activity had already shifted toward the region around the Bosporus. The city of Byzantium itself had long been admired for its remarkable location. Its strategic position was obvious, even in classical Greek times. Its strong defences were demonstrated centuries earlier, when it resisted a long siege during the civil wars of the Roman Empire. Positioned along the main route linking the Danube frontier with the eastern provinces, it was a natural crossroads of military and administrative movement. Later, writers claim that Constantine had considered other possible locations before choosing Byzantium. Some accounts even suggest that construction began elsewhere before the final decision was made. One story claims that Constantine originally planned to rebuild the legendary city of Troy. Another version describes him spending years in Thessalonica, decorating it with grand buildings before turning his attention to Chalcedon. According to the tale, when construction began there, a strange omen occurred. Eagles supposedly carried the foundation stones across the strait to Byzantium, signalling the true location of the future capital. Other narratives describe a sequence of shifting plans, with Constantine examining several sites before finally selecting Byzantium. Yet the historical evidence suggests that once Licinius had been defeated, the project moved forward quickly. Construction of the new imperial city appears to have begun soon after the victory. Even during this period of construction, Nicomedia remained one of Constantine's principal residences. He restored major buildings there, including a basilica, and ordered the construction of a magnificent Christian church. Celebrations marking 20 years of his reign were held there as well. Although Constantine travelled widely during these years, Nicomedia continued to function as an important administrative centre. At the same time, events within the Christian Church increasingly intersected with imperial authority. Delegations from distant provinces travelled to the emperor's court seeking support for their causes. One group from Egypt spent considerable time near the imperial court waiting for the opportunity to present their case. Although a few official documents began to be issued from Constantinople in the 320s, the new city truly emerged as the imperial capital in the year 330, when it was formally dedicated. Ancient authors later described in great detail the many buildings constructed during this period. Most of these structures no longer survive. One major exception is the Hippodrome, whose monuments and sculptures still reflect the ambition of the city's early years. The creation of this new capital had dramatic consequences. Some observers described these changes with open hostility. One writer complained that the city's growing population had been assembled by emptying other cities of their inhabitants. He claimed that massive shipments of grain from Egypt and other provinces were now diverted to feed the swelling crowds of Constantinople. Despite such criticism, certain changes are historically well documented. The new city required vast supplies of food, especially grain from the eastern provinces. Distributions of bread to the population were established early in its history, reinforcing the idea that Constantinople was now taking on the role once associated with Rome. A new Senate was also created for the city. Although its members initially held a slightly lower status than the senators of Rome, the establishment of this body symbolized the city's growing political importance. Over time, many writers came to describe Constantinople as a rival capital to Rome itself. Even so, the shift was gradual rather than immediate. Rome still retained immense prestige and historical authority. Later orators sometimes referred to Constantinople as the Royal City, a title once reserved for Rome. Yet even decades later, some writers continued to treat Rome as the supreme city of the empire. In practical terms, however, Constantinople had become the primary centre of imperial government. After visiting Rome in the mid-320s, Constantine never returned there again, Although he continued to travel through parts of Eastern Europe, he increasingly remained based in the new capital. From this city, he issued many of his official letters and decisions. Communities across the empire sent petitions directly to him there. Religious leaders, scholars, and diplomats all travelled to Constantinople in hopes of gaining imperial attention. The city soon became a focal point of Christian politics as well. Bishops and church leaders frequently appealed directly to the emperor, seeking decisions on theological disputes. These conflicts sometimes reached dramatic conclusions within the city itself. Constantine's own death symbolized the new order that had taken shape. He died near Nicomedia, but was buried in Constantinople, in the Church of the Apostles. In the years that followed, even the leadership of the church shifted toward the new capital as influential bishops relocated there. The transformation also affected the cultural world of the Eastern Mediterranean. Scholars, philosophers, and orators recognized that the emperor's presence had turned Constantinople into the most important stage for intellectual life. Ambitious thinkers began travelling there, hoping to gain recognition in the growing imperial city. A generation earlier, such a movement would have been unimaginable. Athens had long been the traditional centre of Greek intellectual life. Yet once the Roman emperor established his permanent residence in a Greek city, that city inevitably became the new centre of prestige and opportunity. One striking example is the physician Stertinius Xenophon from the island of Kos. His career illustrates how expertise in a specialized field could lead directly into the emperor's inner environment. Xenophon first appears in public life as part of a diplomatic mission defending the privileges of Greek sanctuaries before Roman authorities. Later, he established himself in Rome as a successful doctor. When Claudius chose him as a personal physician, Xenophon reportedly declined the standard salary, claiming that private practice already brought him a far greater income. Claudius responded by doubling the imperial offer and appointing both Xenophon and his brother to lucrative positions. From that point onward, Xenophon accompanied the emperor closely, even joining the imperial expedition to Britain. Honours soon accumulated. He held priesthoods in his native city, received military decorations from Claudius, and acted as an intermediary between the emperor and the Greek world. Public inscriptions celebrated him not only as a physician to the imperial household, but also as a benefactor of his community and a leading religious figure. His influence reached such a level that Claudius himself publicly advocated tax privileges for Kos in response to Xenophon's appeals. Yet the closeness that had elevated him also carried danger. Later accounts accused him of involvement in the conspiracy that poisoned the emperor. A similar figure may have been Claudius Balbillus. Evidence suggests that he combined intellectual authority with administrative responsibilities. He likely served as an intermediary in Greek correspondence and diplomatic matters, while also holding military honours connected with Claudius's British campaign. His earlier connections may have included roles linked to the scholarly institutions of Alexandria, especially the famous museum and its libraries. If so, he represents an important bridge between the scholarly culture of the Greek East and the administrative centre of the Roman Empire. The link between Alexandria's intellectual institutions and the imperial court appears repeatedly in this period. Scholars associated with the museum sometimes entered imperial service, bringing their literary and philosophical training into the heart of government. Chaeremon of Alexandria, for example, was a historian and philosopher who also became a tutor to Nero. Another scholar, Dionysius, eventually oversaw libraries and participated in drafting imperial communications. Their careers show that scholarship and governance could intersect in unexpected ways. During the reign of Hadrian, this pattern continued. Julius Vestinus, another scholar connected with Alexandria's intellectual traditions, later held responsibilities involving imperial studies and official correspondence. He oversaw libraries in Rome and handled the emperor's written communications, demonstrating how intellectual prestige could translate into administrative authority. Greek rhetoricians in particular became prominent figures in imperial service. Their training in eloquence and persuasion was valued in an environment where communication between the emperor and his subjects required clarity, authority, and literary skill. Avidius Heliodorus rose from rhetorical distinction to become prefect of Egypt. His appointment was widely attributed to his mastery of rhetoric, though contemporaries sometimes questioned whether imperial favour could truly transform rhetorical talent into genuine oratory. Another example appears in the figure of Tila, a writer on rhetoric who also served as an imperial secretary. Rivalries among sophists and teachers often accompanied such appointments. Philostratus recounts disputes between intellectuals who competed for influence in the imperial circle, revealing how literary reputation could shape careers within the court. The integration of rhetoric and imperial administration becomes clearer when examining figures described in detail by later writers. Alexander of Seleucia, known for his philosophical eloquence, spent years travelling across the Greek world before being summoned to join the emperor Marcus Aurelius. His role as secretary brought him directly into the emperor's presence during campaigns along the Danube frontier. The honour reflected not military experience, but intellectual prestige. Hadrian of Tyre offers another vivid illustration. Trained in Athens under famous teachers, he achieved extraordinary popularity as a lecturer and sophist. When Marcus Aurelius visited Athens, he listened to Hadrian deliver a rhetorical performance and rewarded him with extensive privileges and honours. Later, the emperor summoned him to Rome to hold the city's most prestigious chair of rhetoric. Even in old age, Hadrian's reputation remained so great that Commodus appointed him imperial secretary as a mark of recognition. The career of Aelius Antipater shows the same pattern developing further. Born into a distinguished family in Asia Minor, he studied under prominent teachers before attracting imperial attention. Eventually, he became responsible for composing the emperor's Greek correspondence and served as tutor to the imperial princes. His influence extended beyond literature into political affairs, and he even held provincial governorships. Antipater's contemporaries sometimes viewed him with suspicion, seeing his closeness to the emperor as a source of power that could shape careers and decisions. Aspasia, another Greek rhetorician, followed a similar path. Though born in the West, he built his reputation through mastery of Greek rhetoric and eventually joined the imperial court as a secretary. His responsibilities included accompanying the emperor on journeys and assisting with official communications. Disputes between intellectuals about the proper style of imperial letters reveal how seriously rhetorical standards were taken. An imperial message was expected to express authority clearly and without unnecessary complexity, since it represented the voice of law itself. Legal expertise formed another route into the emperor's inner advisory circle. Roman law in this period developed through scholarly debate and interpretation, and jurists were frequently consulted in imperial decision-making. Their writings, later preserved in legal compilations, reveal discussions that took place within the emperor's council. Marcus Aurelius Papirius Dionysius illustrates this development. Known as a legal expert, he entered imperial service directly as a member of the emperor's advisory council. Over time, he rose to increasingly powerful administrative posts, eventually becoming prefect of Egypt. His career demonstrates how specialized knowledge could open doors to the highest levels of authority. By the Severan era, the presence of jurists in the imperial advisory circle had become routine. The emperors relied on legal specialists, whose expertise guided decisions affecting the entire empire. Papinian, one of the most renowned jurists of Roman history, served first as an advisor before rising to the position of Praetorian prefect. His legal writings influenced generations of scholars and administrators. Ulpian, another major jurist, came from the Phoenician city of Tyre. His background in legal scholarship brought him into imperial service, where he contributed to official decisions and later held high administrative offices. His works became fundamental sources for Roman law and were preserved in later compilations. Paul, a contemporary jurist, also participated in imperial legal discussions. His writings contain recollections of debates within the emperor's council, offering rare glimpses into how legal judgments were formed. Although his official posts remain uncertain, his presence in these deliberations confirms the importance of legal scholarship within imperial governance. As the centuries progressed, similar patterns continued. Scholars, advocates, and rhetoricians from provincial cities entered imperial service through their reputation for learning. Some later returned to their home regions with increased prestige, while others remained within the administrative machinery of the empire. In the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, the connection between rhetorical education and imperial employment became even more explicit. Teachers of rhetoric often supplied the next generation of officials who would serve in imperial courts, tribunals, and administrative offices. Training in eloquence prepared students not only for legal advocacy, but also for positions drafting imperial communications and advising rulers. Speeches from this period reveal how educators viewed their role. They emphasized that mastery of language and argument equipped students for the responsibilities of public life and service to the emperor. Rhetoric provided the intellectual tools needed to articulate laws, represent communities, and shape imperial policy. Within the imperial court itself, advisors could wield remarkable influence. Some philosophers or intellectuals became trusted confidants whose opinions shaped decisions at the highest level. Their proximity to power sometimes inspired admiration and sometimes suspicion, especially when rivals accused them of manipulating imperial authority. In the later decades of the Roman Empire, anyone who came before the emperor could not fail to notice a powerful figure standing close to him: the Praetorian prefect. When the famous sophist Herodes Atticus appeared before Marcus Aurelius at Sirmium during the 2nd century, it was the Praetorian prefect, Baseius Rufus, who openly threatened him with death. Contemporary writers described Rufus simply as the man entrusted with the sword. That phrase alone revealed his authority, because the sword symbolized the office of the Praetorian prefect more clearly than any title. Among the emperor's close attendants, the prefects were unique. They were the only senior officials who carried weapons. From the moment the office was formally organized under Augustus, the prefects commanded the Praetorian cohorts, the elite soldiers who protected the emperor and accompanied him wherever he traveled. Their authority extended beyond military command. In the emperor's immediate surroundings, they controlled the use of force. Their presence ensured that orders could be enforced instantly. A famous episode illustrates how the symbolism of the sword was understood. When Trajan appointed a new Praetorian prefect, he handed him a sword and declared that it should be used for the emperor if he ruled well, and against him if he ruled badly. The remark was dramatic, but it captured the delicate balance of power within the imperial court. The prefect held extraordinary authority, yet that authority existed only because the emperor allowed it. The responsibilities attached to the office were extensive. Prefects could interrogate suspects and supervise investigations. They were capable of ordering torture during criminal inquiries, a normal part of Roman judicial procedure. One prefect, under Tiberius, personally carried out examinations under torture during political investigations. In another case, he escorted a future king of Judea to the emperor and placed him in chains on imperial orders. Their duties frequently brought them into direct contact with prisoners and suspects. A prefect might deliver accused persons to the emperor, or take charge of individuals whom the emperor wished to question. At times, they even carried out the emperor's written instructions for executions. Seneca recounts a scene in which a Praetorian prefect placed a document before Nero requesting the emperor's authorization to execute 2 captured bandits. The prefect himself presented the order for signature. Other prefects were deeply involved in the violent political struggles of the imperial court. During Nero's reign, one prefect helped persuade the emperor to authorize the deaths of political rivals and supervise the torture of slaves connected with a high-profile case involving the imperial family. Earlier, another prefect had been sent to arrest a powerful senator who had fallen out of favor with the emperor. Imperial authority also depended on the prefects when dealing with prisoners from distant provinces. Provincial governors were instructed to send certain offenders directly to the Praetorian prefects, under guard. These officials then determined how the prisoners should be punished, or whether the emperor himself should hear the case. Legal writers of the 3rd century even state that corrupt officials could be transferred to the prefects for investigation and sentencing. In some situations, the emperor delegated judicial tasks directly to them. If a complicated case reached the emperor personally, he might refer it to the Praetorian prefect for examination and a report. One emperor replied to a complaint about illegal interest payments by informing the petitioner that his prefect would investigate the matter and present the results to him in writing. Another example comes from Egypt during the reign of Septimius Severus. A petition describing violent abuses by a local man was brought before the emperor. Severus ordered that the case be examined by his Praetorian prefect, Fulvius Plautianus, a man who also happened to be related to him by marriage. The prefect was expected to investigate and deliver a judgment. Prefects could also function as a kind of court of appeal. In one case, an emperor advised a man who had been condemned in his absence by a provincial governor to approach the Praetorian prefects, who would correct any injustice if it had occurred. Their authority, therefore, extended well beyond the simple command of soldiers. Sometimes the prefect's involvement was dictated by practical considerations. An imperial physician once complained that his property had been seized while he was away serving in the emperor's entourage. Because his duties prevented him from travelling to pursue the case himself, the emperor instructed the Praetorian prefect to summon the accused parties and judge the dispute on his behalf. Over time, these delegated responsibilities developed into a more regular judicial role. In the earliest period, there is little evidence that the prefects possessed an independent court. Yet by the 2nd century, they were already issuing orders in matters affecting imperial property and public administration. A surviving inscription from Italy records how a financial official wrote to 2 Praetorian prefects complaining that local authorities were interfering with imperial flocks. The prefects responded with a stern warning to the local magistrates that punishment might follow if the interference continued. By the early 3rd century, the prefects had acquired a clearer position within the judicial system. Certain cases originating in Italy were directed to them rather than to other magistrates. Their jurisdiction could involve criminal matters, property disputes, inheritance questions, and appeals. One well-known episode describes a Praetorian prefect personally interrogating a notorious bandit leader whose activities had disturbed large areas of the countryside. Their authority was not limited to Italy. Evidence from imperial letters shows that provincial cases might also be transferred to them when circumstances required it. A governor who discovered that a crime demanded a more severe punishment than he could impose might send the accused to the Praetorian prefect. In such cases, the prefect acted almost as an extension of the emperor's own judicial power. This gradual expansion of responsibilities did not mean that the prefects were independent. Their authority existed because the emperor trusted them. At any moment, he could dismiss them or replace them with someone else. The office depended entirely on imperial favour. By the time of the later empire, the judicial position of the Praetorian prefect had become so powerful that legal scholars debated whether it was even possible to appeal their decisions. Some argued that appeals should still be permitted. Others insisted that the authority of the prefect represented the emperor himself, and therefore could not be challenged. Constantine eventually settled the matter. In a formal declaration, he ruled that no appeal was allowed against the judgments of Praetorian prefects. According to the emperor, they exercised authority in the emperor's own name. Allowing appeals from their decisions would imply that the emperor's own authority could be questioned. The statement reveals how far the office had evolved. What had begun as the command of an elite guard had developed into one of the most powerful positions in the imperial administration. The Praetorian prefect stood beside the emperor, not only as a military commander, but also as judge, investigator, and enforcer of imperial power. The wider judicial authority of the Praetorian prefects grew out of something much more basic and far more powerful. They were, above all, the emperor's protectors and the commanders of the elite troops stationed closest to him. Their office was rooted in proximity. They were not distant administrators working from afar, but men whose position placed them physically beside the ruler, sharing his movements, his dangers, and often his private world. That closeness matters, because it explains why their background was often very different from the other men who surrounded the emperor in daily life. Many members of the imperial circle came from cultivated, political, or literary settings, but a large number of Praetorian prefects rose through hard military service and administrative discipline. The contrast becomes especially clear in the 2nd century, and one of the best examples is Marcus Bassius Rufus. Ancient observers noted that he was capable and respectable, yet lacking in formal education, a trait explained by his rural origins. His long public career shows the classic route by which such a man could reach the highest equestrian office. He advanced from senior legionary command to tribuneships in the major corps stationed at Rome, returned again to legionary distinction, and then moved through a sequence of major procuratorships before reaching the most influential financial posts. From there, he held the prefectures of the Vigiles, Egypt, and finally the Praetorian Guard. His career reveals that from the late 1st century into the middle of the 3rd, the Praetorian prefecture was often the reward for men who had spent decades proving themselves in military and administrative service. In earlier reigns, the system was less regular, and appointments could still depend more heavily on intimacy with the emperor. But even then, many holders of the office already had serious careers behind them. Some had directed the urban watch, some had controlled grain supply, some had served powerful members of the imperial household, and some had risen by combining military experience with trusted service to the court. Even during the period when the office followed a more recognizable pattern, it never became a simple mechanical promotion. The emperor still chose whom he wished, and personal favor could override every expectation. A man might be summoned to the post by a direct imperial letter while still serving elsewhere, or he might retire only after a personal exchange with the ruler that showed how intimate the relationship could become. Behind what appears on paper as an orderly progression of offices, there was often a hidden network of patronage, advocacy, recommendation, and private access. The rise of Macrinus shows how much depended on these connections. Coming from Caesarea in Mauritania, he first became known through legal work, entered the service of a powerful prefect, survived the fall of that patron through the intervention of a senior senator close to the emperor, and from there received new appointments until he reached the Praetorian prefecture itself. The office, therefore, stood at the meeting point of merit, favour, ambition, and chance. That same closeness to power also made it dangerous. The prefect stood near the emperor in war, in judgment, in travel, and in moments of political tension. Such prominence invited suspicion, and the history of the office is marked again and again by sudden violence. Many prefects died abruptly, whether through imperial distrust, conspiracy, or their own overreaching ambitions. In quieter periods, this did not happen, which is itself a sign of greater political stability. But the pattern remained. Praetorian prefects played decisive roles in the fall of several emperors, and at times their unique position allowed them to turn from guardians of imperial power into claimants of it. Macrinus himself became emperor after Caracalla's murder, and a similar pattern appeared when Philip rose after the death of Gordian III. These moments were not accidents. They were the logical outcome of an office built on armed command, daily access, and political intimacy. The true nature of the prefect's role can be seen in the fact that, until the early 4th century, he was expected to accompany the emperor wherever he went. This was not an occasional duty. It was one of the defining features of the position. From the early empire onward, prefects appear beside rulers on campaigns, during provincial tours, at frontier headquarters, and in moments of crisis. Sejanus accompanied Drusus to Pannonia. Macro was present with Tiberius in Campania during the emperor's final days. Others went to Britain, to Greece, to Dacia, to Cilicia, to the Danubian Wars, to Alexandria, to Asia Minor, to Mesopotamia, and to the eastern frontier. Their presence was not ceremonial. They commanded troops, handled missions, shared logistical burdens, influenced access, and in some cases exercised so much authority that their quarters and supplies rivaled or even surpassed those of the emperor himself. In one telling episode from the reign of Septimius Severus, the emperor had to request a fish from a prefect's stores, a detail that reveals how much power and privilege could gather around a man who stood so close to the centre. Even in the turbulent 3rd century, the pattern remained visible. Prefects joined emperors in campaigns against Persians, in military journeys across the Balkans and Italy, and in the disasters that overtook rulers on the move. Under the Tetrarchy, the picture becomes harder to trace in detail. Yet prefects still appear as commanders, agents, and close executors of imperial orders. When Constantine later destroyed the Praetorian camp at Rome and ended the Old Guard as a political force, this did not erase the importance of Praetorian prefects. Instead, the office began to evolve in a new direction, becoming more regional and administrative. Yet before that transformation was complete, the prefect had already spent generations as one of the men most constantly at the emperor's side. That nearness extended beyond war and politics into the everyday rhythm of imperial life. The prefect was not necessarily always present at every moment, but he could share more than formal hours of state business. Trusted prefects dined with emperors, accompanied them in leisure, guarded their persons, and handled prisoners, suspects, and politically sensitive cases. In imagined or dramatized scenes from later literature, the prefect appears arranging the details of major trials, informing defendants of the charges against them, and standing beside the emperor during legal hearings. Even if such stories are polished by rhetoric, they rest on a believable reality. The prefect was normally one of the ruler's advisors in judicial matters, and his position in that setting helps explain why he might appear in legal proceedings, even when accusations touched men close to the throne. Some prefects became known for their exhausting dedication to legal work, spending long hours in or near the palace and hearing cases deep into the night. In at least one case, the line between the emperor's justice and the prefect's own courtroom became almost impossible to separate. Under Septimius Severus, a report survives of an official refusing to move a case forward because the prefect had not yet instructed him. That small detail says a great deal. It shows a world in which the prefect was not a mere bodyguard or military officer, but a central figure in the machinery through which imperial authority reached ordinary subjects. He was present when decisions were made, when suspects were examined, when justice was dispensed, and when policy took practical form. The prefect also had a place among the emperor's closest associates in private consultation. When rulers withdrew with selected companions to discuss matters great or trivial, the Praetorian prefect often stood among them. He could appear beside senators and long-established members of the imperial circle, even though his own background might be very different from theirs. This contrast is important. Many prefects had come upward through camp, command and bureaucracy, rather than through eloquence or traditional aristocratic culture. They were marked by their military authority, symbolized even in dress, and they brought into the imperial inner circle a different kind of power. Yet this difference did not exclude them. On the contrary, it helped prepare the way for the later expansion of their independent administrative role. While they remained attached to the emperor's person, they were still court figures shaped by favour and vulnerable to danger. But already they stood slightly apart, combining armed command, administrative experience, legal authority, and direct access to the ruler in a way unmatched by almost anyone else at court. A later figure like Flavius Ablabius shows how these older patterns continued, while the empire itself changed. Ancient writers remembered him as a man of humble beginnings who climbed astonishingly high, first serving in a minor position in his native Crete, before rising to immense wealth, senatorial status, and the Praetorian prefecture. Stories about his life emphasize both the dramatic reach of imperial opportunity and the deadly risks that accompanied it. He was credited with influence over Constantine, connected to major political and religious affairs, and involved in the atmosphere of rivalry and suspicion that always surrounded a powerful court. Evidence from his career shows him intervening with the emperor on behalf of a provincial community and receiving an answer couched in language of unusual warmth and confidence. He also appears as a Christian official whose faith shaped his place within the new imperial order. In one striking moment, during a dispute involving Athanasius, a festival letter was sent from the court through an imperial officer after being entrusted to Ablabius, who was described as a man who truly feared God. That detail captures both continuity and change. The Praetorian prefect was still acting in the long-standing tradition of a senior official at the emperor's side, able to assist, transmit, protect, and influence. But the world around him had shifted. The court was now Christian, its language was changing, and new religious loyalties were becoming part of the calculations of power. Even so, the deeper truth remained the same. The Praetorian prefect was one of the clearest expressions of how the Roman emperor ruled through personal presence, delegated trust, and the dangerous closeness of men who stood beside the throne. Imperial generosity was never a one-way relationship. While emperors distributed wealth and favours, they were also constantly receiving gifts from across the empire and from distant lands beyond its borders. Rulers, envoys, city delegations, and even private individuals approached the imperial court carrying offerings meant to demonstrate loyalty, respect, or diplomatic goodwill. At the palace in Constantinople, observers described a steady procession of foreign visitors arriving before the emperor. These delegations often came from regions outside Roman control and brought with them the treasures most valued in their own cultures. Some carried golden crowns, others presented jeweled diadems glittering with precious stones. There were exotic garments embroidered with gold thread and elaborate patterns. Some delegations brought horses or weapons as symbols of military alliance, while others offered rare goods and unusual curiosities from distant lands. Even young attendants with distinctive physical features were sometimes included among the gifts. The emperor accepted each offering carefully and acknowledged the gesture with impressive generosity. Those who had presented gifts were often rewarded immediately with wealth or honours, reinforcing the prestige of both the giver and the imperial court. This exchange of gifts had deep roots and had long been part of Roman political culture. During the reign of Augustus, for example, northern envoys once arrived, requesting friendship, and presented him with a sacred cauldron as a ceremonial gift. On another occasion, an embassy from India reached the Roman world carrying extraordinary offerings. The envoys travelled with attendants who brought rare animals and remarkable curiosities, meant to astonish the Roman court. Among them was a boy who had no arms but could perform complex tasks, using only his feet, an example of the strange and exotic spectacles that foreign envoys sometimes used to capture the attention of Roman audiences. Such diplomatic exchanges were not simply theatrical displays. They played an important role in imperial diplomacy, reinforcing alliances and demonstrating submission or admiration toward Roman power. Subjects of the empire also offered gifts to the emperor on many different occasions. Some of these presentations followed established customs, while others occurred spontaneously. A number of strange and unusual objects were given to emperors, and then displayed publicly as curiosities. One ruler in the Near East once sent a creature described as a hippopotamus-like beast with unusual features to the Emperor Claudius. The animal died before it reached Rome, but it was preserved and displayed as a marvel in the imperial palace before eventually being stored in imperial warehouses. Other curiosities appeared in similar ways. Even ordinary subjects sometimes attempted to win imperial attention through unusual gifts. One famous example involved a fisherman who caught an enormous fish and presented it directly to the Emperor Domitian. The gesture was so extraordinary that it became the subject of satire and literary commentary. Similar events had occurred earlier under other emperors, suggesting that unusual natural discoveries were sometimes offered to rulers in hopes of gaining favour or recognition. Rare animals were also displayed for public curiosity. On one occasion, Nero exhibited a group of horses with unusual biological characteristics that had been discovered in the provinces. The practice of displaying rare or exotic gifts outside the imperial palace became well known and even entered religious literature of the period. While many of these offerings had little economic importance, other gifts represented considerable wealth. One example involved a massive golden necklace weighing around 100 pounds that was presented to Augustus by a delegation from Gaul. Objects like this were valuable not only as ceremonial ornaments, but also as stores of precious metal that could later be reused or converted into coin if necessary. The most significant and frequent gifts of this kind were the golden crowns presented to emperors on important occasions. These crowns were typically offered during celebrations such as imperial accessions or military victories. The tradition had originated in the Greek world, where cities honoured victorious rulers with golden wreaths. As Roman power expanded into the eastern Mediterranean, Greek cities began offering these crowns to Roman generals, and later, to emperors themselves. In the late Republic and early Empire, these golden offerings could be extremely substantial. Cities from across the Mediterranean sent embassies carrying heavy golden wreaths to honour Roman commanders after major victories. Over time, the practice became a regular part of imperial ceremonial life. When Augustus celebrated a major triumph in Rome, cities across Italy alone presented him with golden crowns, weighing tens of thousands of pounds in total. Augustus declined to accept these gifts on that occasion, but the gesture itself revealed how widespread the tradition had become. In the provinces, the practice continued without interruption. Delegations arrived before the emperor, formally presented their crowns, and delivered ceremonial speeches praising imperial achievements. These presentations were carefully staged events. The crown was brought by a delegation from a city or community and handed over in person before the emperor. A formal speech accompanied the offering, expressing loyalty and gratitude. Even when the offering had become expected or customary, it still retained the outward appearance of a voluntary gift. In later centuries, similar ceremonies continued when emperors were proclaimed or celebrated victories. Cities sent embassies carrying gold crowns and took advantage of the opportunity to present petitions or requests, while appearing before the ruler. Over time, the tradition of the golden crown evolved into something more complicated. Although crowns continued to be offered ceremonially, the idea eventually developed into a regular financial obligation known as crown gold. Cities were expected to contribute money equivalent to a golden crown on certain occasions, such as an emperor's accession. Even so, the ceremonial offering of an actual crown retained symbolic importance, since it represented direct loyalty from a community to the emperor himself. The Roman people as a whole did not present golden crowns to their ruler, but individuals within Rome sometimes gave gifts of money to the emperor. For a time, it was customary for citizens to present small monetary gifts at the beginning of each new year. Augustus accepted these offerings and used them to purchase statues placed in neighbourhood shrines throughout the city. The exchange was partly symbolic, since the emperor often gave back more in return than he received. Later, emperors modified or even abolished the custom when it became inconvenient or excessive. One emperor objected to the endless stream of visitors, bringing gifts throughout the month, and limited the practice to a single day. Another ruler revived the custom and personally received offerings in a temple courtyard while seated in public view. These New Year gifts were never a major source of income. Their real importance lay in the symbolic relationship they created between the emperor and the people. On other occasions, communities or individuals offered contributions for specific needs. When a fire damaged the imperial residence in Rome, many cities and private donors volunteered funds to help rebuild it. The emperor accepted only small symbolic contributions from each donor, refusing larger sums in order to avoid appearing greedy. In another instance, funds were raised to support a military treasury intended to pay soldiers. Foreign kings and communities contributed willingly, though private individuals were not permitted to do so. Not every contribution was truly voluntary. At times, emperors demanded gifts from cities or wealthy individuals, especially during financial emergencies. After the Great Fire that devastated Rome during Nero's reign, contributions were collected across the empire. Officially, these were described as voluntary offerings, but in reality, they were often demanded by imperial officials. Some cities gave enormous sums of money under pressure. On later occasions, emperors refused similar contributions, specifically because they feared accusations that the payments were being forced. The boundary between voluntary gifts and compulsory payments was often blurred. A ruler might claim that contributions were expressions of loyalty, while subjects understood that refusal could bring consequences. In some cases, emperors even punished cities that had previously supported political rivals by demanding large payments in retaliation. At other times, rulers openly expected gifts from communities seeking imperial favour. Stories from the later empire illustrate how this system could operate in practice. One account describes an emperor who temporarily asked wealthy citizens to contribute money in order to demonstrate loyalty. They willingly filled the imperial treasury with gold and silver, believing they were supporting their ruler. Once the demonstration had been made and imperial officials had inspected the wealth, the emperor returned the money to its owners. The episode was meant to illustrate generosity, but it also reveals how easily rulers could call upon private wealth when necessary. Beyond coins and precious metal, emperors also controlled enormous stores of valuables. These included luxury objects, works of art, rare commodities, and elaborate furnishings kept within imperial residences. In the ancient world, wealth was not stored only as currency. Precious fabrics, jewellery, decorative vessels, and other luxury goods could serve as reserves of value. Such items might remain unused for long periods, yet could be sold, melted down, or repurposed when circumstances required. Imperial palaces therefore functioned partly as vast storehouses of wealth. They contained statues, artworks, and treasures collected from across the Mediterranean world. Many of these pieces had originally been taken during wars or civil conflicts, while others were purchased or received as diplomatic gifts. Some remained in the imperial household, while others were displayed in temples or public spaces throughout Rome. Famous works of Greek sculpture and painting eventually found their way into imperial collections. Certain masterpieces were placed in imperial gardens, while others were displayed in temples, built or restored by emperors. Occasionally, rulers returned artworks to their original cities as gestures of goodwill. In other cases, the pieces were kept in Rome as symbols of imperial prestige. During the reign of Constantine, the scale of this process increased dramatically. Vast numbers of statues and artworks were removed from cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean and transported to the new imperial capital at Constantinople. Some observers believed this was done simply to decorate the new city with the greatest masterpieces of classical art. Others interpreted the removal differently, arguing that pagan statues were being stripped of their sacred context and displayed merely as historical curiosities. At times, the precious metals contained in these statues were melted down and reused. Gold and silver taken from temples could be converted into coin or used for imperial projects. Earlier, rulers had done the same during times of financial pressure. Temple treasures had occasionally been melted down to pay soldiers or fund military campaigns. Precious objects could easily shift between different forms of wealth. A statue might become bullion, bullion might become coin, and coin might later be transformed again into luxury ornaments. Imperial luxury items could also be sold when money was urgently needed. Several emperors organized large public auctions of palace treasures. Silk garments, jeweled ornaments, fine furniture, and valuable artworks were sold to raise funds for wars or government expenses. One emperor even allowed buyers to return the items later and reclaim their money once the crisis had passed. In other situations, the sale of imperial possessions was intended to signal a break from the extravagance of a previous ruler. Although such sales were rare, they demonstrate how immense the imperial reserves of wealth could be. Most of the time, these treasures remained in storage or were used for ceremonial display. They accompanied the emperor in processions, decorated imperial residences, and reinforced the grandeur expected of Roman monarchy. Some were also used as diplomatic gifts, while others were dedicated to temples and religious institutions. Despite the abundance of luxury objects, emperors constantly required large quantities of coin for everyday expenses. Gifts, salaries, military payments, and public distributions all required ready cash. Yet the precise locations where imperial money was stored remain unclear. Ancient sources occasionally mention imperial treasuries, but it is often uncertain whether these references describe actual buildings or simply the general wealth of the emperor. Even in Rome, the organization of imperial finances is difficult to reconstruct. Emperors clearly had access to enormous sums of money, but the details of how it was stored or transported are rarely recorded. On certain occasions, rulers distributed millions of coins to soldiers or citizens. When Augustus died, his will ordered the payment of vast sums to the Roman people and to the army. He specified that the money was already set aside and ready to be distributed. At times, emperors could also release large quantities of money to stabilize the economy. One ruler once made an enormous interest-free loan to relieve a financial crisis in Rome. The coins used for this operation must have come from imperial reserves, yet the exact source is never described. Outside Rome, the situation becomes even harder to understand. Emperors frequently travelled through the provinces or conducted military campaigns far from the capital. During these journeys, they still needed access to large amounts of money. Sometimes, coin was transported with them in wagons or on pack animals. In other cases, treasure ships or caravans carried large stores of wealth to accompany military operations. Valuable objects might also travel with the emperor. Certain statues, ceremonial vessels, or trophies captured in war were carried along as symbols of victory and imperial authority. These objects could later be dedicated in temples or displayed publicly to commemorate imperial success. In the later empire, the connection between imperial travel, regional capitals, and coin production became more visible. Some major imperial centers developed their own mints, allowing coins to be produced wherever the emperor established his court. Cities such as Troia, Aquileia, Thessalonica, and Antioch became important locations where imperial administration and coin production intersected. These centers served as political headquarters, financial hubs, and strategic bases from which emperors governed the empire. Even so, the full system behind imperial finance remains difficult to reconstruct. Precious metals move through many channels. Mining operations, temple treasures, diplomatic gifts, taxes, and the melting down of luxury objects. Coins circulated widely, but were also stored in large reserves that might remain untouched for years. When the emperor travelled, he might carry wealth with him or draw upon resources already gathered in provincial centres. During the Tetrarchic period, the imperial government sought to secure steady supplies of precious metals, especially gold. Evidence from Egypt shows that the authorities required regular purchases of gold directly from the population. These transactions began at least by the year 300 and involved monthly deliveries sold to the state at a fixed price. Although the gold was technically purchased, the pressure placed on local communities makes it clear that participation was not truly voluntary. Officials expected these deliveries, and the system functioned more like a compulsory obligation than a free market exchange. One surviving letter from the early 4th century illustrates how closely these operations were tied to the imperial court. The message, sent from a high official to the city council of Oxyrhynchus, ordered the city to provide a large quantity of gold. Payment would come from the imperial treasury at an established rate per pound. The gold had to be delivered first to Alexandria and then shipped onward to Nicomedia. where the emperor was residing at the time. This document reveals how local communities across the empire could be drawn into the financial needs of the imperial household. Resources collected in a provincial city could quickly be redirected to wherever the ruler and his court were based. Even with such records, the exact purpose of these precious metals often remains unclear. The government may have been accumulating gold simply to maintain reserves, or it may have intended to use it for minting coins or financing imperial projects. The surviving evidence rarely provides enough detail to determine exactly how these metals were later used. Ancient writers occasionally give us rare glimpses into the types of goods stored in imperial warehouses. In the 2nd century, for example, imperial supplies included valuable commodities such as cinnamon, honey, and wine. Yet even these scattered references cannot reveal the full scale or organization of imperial treasuries. The internal finances of the emperor's household remained largely hidden from public view. Another major source of imperial wealth came from inheritances and legacies. When powerful individuals died, it was common for them to include the emperor among the beneficiaries in their wills. This practice had both financial and political meaning. Leaving a portion of one's estate to the ruler demonstrated loyalty and respect, while also protecting the family from suspicion or hostility. In many cases, the emperor received money, valuable objects, or land as part of these arrangements. An example from the late 1st century before the Common Era shows how significant these gifts could be. When Herod the Great died, he left a large amount of silver coins and valuable luxury goods to the Roman emperor. He also left substantial sums to members of the imperial household. The emperor accepted only a small portion of these possessions and returned most of the wealth to Herod's heirs. This decision reflected the careful balance rulers often tried to maintain between accepting gifts and appearing generous. Public reputation mattered greatly, and emperors sometimes refused large inheritances in order to display moderation. The custom of including the emperor in a will had deep roots in Roman society. Wealthy individuals often named friends or political allies as partial heirs. Over time, the emperor gradually became one of the most common beneficiaries in such arrangements. Writers from the early empire describe several prominent figures who divided their estates among relatives, friends, and the emperor himself. Even people outside the emperor's immediate circle sometimes chose to include him in their wills as a gesture of respect. This practice was not always entirely voluntary. Social pressure played a powerful role. If a wealthy person failed to mention the emperor in a will, observers might interpret the omission as an insult. Some rulers quietly expected to be remembered by their supporters, while others were far less restrained. In certain periods, individuals even feared that their estates might be seized if the emperor believed he had been deliberately excluded. The enormous scale of these inheritances can be seen in the wealth accumulated by the first emperor over a period of 20 years. According to later accounts, he received vast sums through the wills of friends and associates. Much of this wealth was then spent on public needs, including building projects, military expenses, and gifts to the population. Even so, the total amount he received was extraordinary, rivaling the yearly income of some of the richest provinces of the empire. Later, emperors continued to benefit from similar arrangements, though the details varied from reign to reign. Some rulers refused inheritances from strangers, accepting only those from personal friends. Others were accused of using intimidation or legal pressure to secure a share of estates. In extreme cases, a dying individual might name the emperor as heir simply to protect the remaining family property from confiscation. Legal experts in the 2nd and 3rd centuries eventually addressed the complex problems created by this system. Roman jurists debated whether ordinary inheritance laws also applied when the emperor was a beneficiary. Several legal rulings confirmed that the emperor should still follow the general rules governing wills and legacies. These discussions show that, despite the emperor's enormous power, legal traditions continued to shape the handling of inheritances. The broader importance of this custom becomes clear when considering the nature of wealth in the ancient world. Unlike modern economies, where wealth can expand rapidly through production and trade, ancient wealth was relatively stable. Land, precious metals, and luxury goods rarely multiplied quickly. Because of this, the transfer of property through inheritance played a crucial role in redistributing resources across society. For the emperor, receiving part of an estate could be one of the easiest ways to increase his own financial resources. Yet inheritances were only one part of a much larger system through which wealth flowed toward the imperial government. Another important category involved property that had no legal owner. If a person died without heirs, or if a will was declared invalid, the property might fall to the imperial treasury. This type of property became known as ownerless goods. In such cases, the state stepped in as the ultimate recipient. Earlier kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean had similar systems. In Egypt, for example, royal officials managed a special account that received the proceeds from confiscated goods, abandoned land, and property without heirs. After Rome took control of Egypt, this institution continued to operate under imperial authority. Officials supervised the transfer of ownerless property into the emperor's financial system. Roman rulers also dealt with situations in which a will was legally invalid. Certain laws restricted who could receive inheritances. If someone attempted to leave property to a person who was legally barred from accepting it, the inheritance could become void. In such cases, the property again passed into the imperial treasury. These rules created a steady flow of wealth toward the emperor. Legal texts from the imperial period show that ownerless property and invalid inheritances became an established part of state finances. Officials across the empire reported such cases, and the proceeds were transferred to imperial accounts. Even more controversial was the seizure of property from individuals convicted of serious crimes. In earlier Roman history, the goods of condemned men had often been sold at auction. During periods of civil conflict, these confiscations became widespread, especially when victorious factions rewarded supporters with the property of defeated enemies. Under the empire, confiscation gradually expanded into a regular part of criminal punishment. Individuals condemned for major offences could lose their entire estates. This applied not only to political crimes, but also to certain serious violations of law. When a person was sentenced to exile or other severe penalties, the state too often claimed their property as well. The emperor controlled how these confiscated goods were distributed. Some properties were kept as imperial assets, while others were granted to supporters or sold for profit. In some cases, rulers restored confiscated property to families of the condemned as an act of mercy. In other periods, confiscations became a notorious tool of political repression. These practices also contributed to the growth of imperial landholdings. Large estates, mines, and industrial facilities gradually accumulated under imperial control. Some of these properties had originally belonged to wealthy individuals who had fallen from favour. Others had entered imperial possession through inheritance or the absence of heirs. Over time, the emperor became one of the largest landowners in the Roman world. Imperial estates existed in many regions of the empire, producing agricultural goods and generating rent from tenants. Mines and quarries were also operated under imperial supervision, supplying valuable resources to the state. Despite their scale, these properties were managed in ways similar to private estates. Officials known as procurators supervised production, collected rents, and enforced regulations among workers and tenants. In many regions, the imperial estates formed communities of their own, with villages, farms, and workshops operating under administrative oversight. This complex system allowed emperors to accumulate and redistribute wealth throughout the empire. Property could move from private hands into imperial control through inheritance, confiscation, or legal technicalities. From there, it might remain part of the imperial domain, be granted to allies, or fund major public projects. The development of imperial control over mines and other productive properties cannot be reconstructed with certainty, yet several important features can still be identified. During the Roman Republic, mines in Italy and in the provinces were typically leased by the censors to private contractors, known as publicani. These entrepreneurs organized the labor and extracted metals while paying the state for the right to operate the mines. Some evidence suggests that this practice may have continued in certain regions even into the early imperial period, particularly in parts of Spain where mineral resources had long been exploited. At the same time, another system existed elsewhere in the Mediterranean world. In Ptolemaic Egypt, condemned criminals were forced to work in mines under extremely harsh conditions. Although there is no clear evidence that the Roman Republic used mines as places of punishment, this Egyptian precedent demonstrates that such practices were already known in the broader ancient world. Under the Roman Empire, ownership patterns gradually changed. Some mines, along with agricultural estates, workshops, storehouses, and other productive facilities, came into imperial possession through processes such as inheritance, confiscation, or political transfer. Once these resources became imperial property, they formed part of the vast network of assets controlled by the emperor. Evidence from various periods also shows that imperial properties could serve functions beyond production. Some estates or villas were used as places of confinement for political prisoners. Members of the imperial family themselves were sometimes held in such locations. One emperor destroyed a villa where his mother had once been kept under guard, and later rulers confined relatives on islands or in remote estates when internal conflicts arose. These episodes reveal how imperial property could be used not only for economic purposes, but also for maintaining political control. In other cases, imperial estates served as destinations for individuals condemned under criminal law. A letter from a Christian bishop during the mid-3rd century records an imperial decree ordering that certain imperial freedmen who confessed to Christianity should have their property confiscated and be sent in chains to work on imperial estates. The order followed similar instructions concerning other Christians who had been sentenced to punishment. In this context, the transfer to imperial property was clearly part of a judicial penalty. This evidence raises an important question about the famous punishments that sent prisoners to the mines. Roman legal texts emphasize that a person condemned to the mines did not become a slave belonging to the emperor or to the imperial treasury. Instead, he became what was called a slave of the penalty. The distinction mattered in law, even if it was often blurred in practice. If such a prisoner later received a pardon from the emperor, his status changed again and he became a slave of the treasury, rather than returning to his previous master. In another situation, if a condemned worker escaped, was captured by bandits and then sold as a slave, the purchaser would be reimbursed by the imperial treasury once the individual was returned to his sentence. Over time, these technical distinctions became increasingly difficult to maintain. By the 4th century, punishment involving forced labour had expanded beyond the mines. Workshops for dyeing cloth and weaving textiles were also used as places where condemned individuals could be sent to work. After a major political victory, an emperor proclaimed the release of Christians who had been forced into such establishments and compelled to perform exhausting labour, or treated as if they belonged to the imperial treasury. Most historical references to forced labour connected with religious persecution, however, still involve the mines. Early Christian writers often described believers being condemned to mining work. One author remarked that Christians were sent to the mines from which the raw materials of pagan idols themselves were extracted. He also noted that the metals used for temples ultimately came from mines that were under imperial authority. These comments reflect a widespread perception that mines and quarries were associated closely with the emperor's power. Private ownership of mines probably did not disappear entirely. Some evidence suggests that individual operators continued to manage certain sites. In other places, mining shafts were leased to contractors who employed free workers under contract. Yet the impression remained that the most important mines were linked to imperial control, and that many prisoners sentenced to hard labour were sent to these imperial sites. The workers were often branded and had their heads shaved as marks of their punishment. This arrangement raised further questions about how mining operations functioned in practice. In some regions, mines were leased to contractors who hired free labourers. In others, forced labour may have been used directly. It is possible that both systems operated at the same time in different locations. Unfortunately, the surviving evidence is too limited to allow a clear reconstruction of the overall system. The same uncertainty appears when examining other imperial resources, such as quarries. Some quarries produced valuable stone used in monumental construction across the empire. An inscription from the city of Smyrna records that a prominent figure secured large numbers of marble columns as gifts for the city from the emperor. These columns came from famous quarries in Asia Minor and North Africa, which were supervised by imperial officials. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence confirms that several major marble quarries were under direct imperial administration. Imperial freedmen served as managers, overseeing the extraction and shipment of stone. These quarries supplied materials for imperial palaces and public buildings across the empire. Marble from these sites became a hallmark of imperial architecture. The workforce in these quarries is not always clearly documented. Some sites may have used free labourers or slaves employed directly by imperial administrators. In at least one quarry in the Egyptian desert, however, ancient writers explicitly state that condemned prisoners carried out the work. Similar references appear in other sources describing prisoners sent to labour in quarries or mining operations. Direct observation from ancient authors also provides insight into mining conditions. One physician who visited copper mines in Cyprus reported that the imperial procurator in charge allowed him to inspect the site and collect samples from the slag heaps. Some workers, he observed, were chained, indicating that they were probably slaves or prisoners condemned to forced labour. Accounts from the early 4th century mention Christians who were transferred between mines in Palestine and Cyprus as part of their punishment. Imperial properties were not limited to mining and quarrying. Agricultural estates also formed a significant part of imperial wealth. These estates produced a variety of goods that could be consumed by the imperial household or distributed more widely. One physician records that herb growers in Crete supplied plants used in preparing medicines for the emperor. These herbs were sent not only to the emperor, but also to the city of Rome, where they were sold by merchants. Other scattered references suggest similar patterns of production and distribution. Lead seals discovered in Egypt indicate shipments of aromatic substances connected with the imperial household. In Greece, a writer remarks that the olive oil of a particular region was sent to the emperor. Such remarks hint at networks through which specialized products moved from provincial estates to imperial centers. In some cases, imperial administration directly managed valuable agricultural resources. A well-known example concerns balsam plantations near Jericho. These plantations had once belonged to earlier rulers, but later came under imperial control. The state cultivated the plants and sold the balsam, which was prized for medicinal and cosmetic uses. Yet even here, the exact legal origins of imperial ownership remain uncertain. These examples largely involve luxury goods with high market value. It made sense for such products to be gathered and transported to major cities, where they could be sold or used. For ordinary agricultural estates, the situation was probably different. Evidence from Egypt shows that many imperial lands were leased to tenants who farmed them and paid rent. Documents from the region refer to these estates and to the individuals who rented them from the imperial administration. In some cases, tenants fell into debt to the imperial treasury when they failed to pay their obligations. A surviving letter from the late 2nd century orders the confiscation of property belonging to a former tenant who owed money to the state. Similar arrangements appear in inscriptions from Asia Minor that mention tenants leasing imperial lands. The structure of payments from these estates varied. In certain regions, tenants may have paid rent entirely in cash. In others, they likely delivered part of their rent in agricultural produce. Evidence from North Africa indicates that estates there supplied both money and grain. This mixed system of payment would have allowed the imperial administration to obtain resources in multiple forms. Produce from imperial estates sometimes entered broader supply networks. Grain associated with the emperor was stored in villages in Galilee during the 1st century. This grain may have come from imperial lands rather than from regular taxation. Likewise, fragments of wine jars found in Rome appear to have transported products originating from imperial estates in Spain. Interestingly, these containers lack certain markings that appear on other jars, and that may indicate the payment of customs duties. Roman legal texts state that the imperial treasury was exempt from many indirect taxes, although merchants who traded with imperial estates were not. This detail suggests that goods from imperial lands could be sold locally or transported through commercial networks. Despite these scattered clues, the economic role of imperial properties remains difficult to define with precision. Evidence comes from isolated inscriptions, legal texts, and literary references that rarely form a complete picture. Different regions of the empire likely followed different practices, and these practices also evolved over several centuries. A particularly striking glimpse into the scale of imperial property appears in records describing the endowments made by Constantine to churches in Rome during the early 4th century. These records list numerous estates across Italy and the provinces that were assigned to support religious institutions. Each estate is described as producing a fixed annual income in money. Some of the estates also provided goods in kind, such as spices, oil, linen, papyrus, and aromatic substances. These items were not necessarily produced on the estates themselves. Instead, they were probably goods that could be obtained in regions such as Egypt and Syria, and then transported to Rome. Their role may have been partly economic, functioning as commodities that could be sold if necessary. At the same time, many of these products also had religious uses. Incense, oil, and aromatic substances were essential elements in Christian rituals. Records of imperial donations to churches mention annual gifts of incense for altars and of oils or perfumes used in religious ceremonies. These donations illustrate how imperial resources could be redirected toward new institutions during the Christian Empire. Whether the estates had previously sent such goods directly to the emperor remains uncertain. What is clear is that they produced substantial revenues in cash. By transferring these estates to churches, the emperor effectively created a lasting source of income that supported religious communities. Imperial properties, therefore, served many purposes. They generated revenue, produced valuable goods, supplied materials for construction, and sometimes provided places of confinement or punishment. They could also be granted to cities, individuals, or religious institutions as acts of imperial generosity. In Italy, the emperor's estates often resembled those of wealthy aristocrats from earlier periods. They produced agricultural goods and supported pastoral activities. An inscription from central Italy describes flocks belonging to the emperor that moved seasonally between mountain pastures and lowland plains. These flocks were managed by contractors who leased them from the imperial administration. When conflicts arose between these contractors and local authorities, the imperial administration could intervene on their behalf. A complaint by the managers of imperial flocks led to a formal letter from high officials warning local magistrates not to interfere with imperial interests. This example shows how imperial property carried legal and political advantages beyond those of ordinary private estates. At the same time, many imperial villas function not only as productive estates, but also as residences and places of leisure. Roman aristocratic culture placed great value on rural retreats, where landowners could hunt, fish, dine with friends, and oversee agricultural work. Emperors continued these traditions. Some imperial estates contained fish ponds, stocked with prized species. Writers describe fish in these ponds that were so accustomed to their surroundings that they would approach visitors. Other estates had gardens and orchards that supplied fresh produce to the imperial household. One emperor was particularly fond of cucumbers, and his gardeners developed methods of cultivating them throughout the year using movable beds and protective coverings. Occasionally, emperors participated personally in agricultural activities. One account describes an emperor and his successor working together during the grape harvest at a country villa and later sharing a meal with the workers. Such stories emphasize the ideal image of the ruler as a traditional Roman landowner engaged in the rhythms of rural life. When attempting to determine whether imperial funds were routinely used to support ongoing public functions, the surviving evidence becomes extremely thin. A few reasonable assumptions can be made, but clear documentation is rare. It is likely that imperial resources covered the salaries of imperial freedmen who performed administrative duties across the empire. These individuals were involved in a wide range of governmental or semi-governmental activities. It is also probable that equestrian procurators, who supervised imperial finances and properties, received their pay from the same source. Even so, explicit statements about how these officials were compensated are almost non-existent. Occasionally, a glimpse appears. The architect Vitruvius, writing in the time of Augustus, speaks of the financial support he received as a personal favour confirmed by the emperor. The wording makes it clear that he did not regard his income as coming from a public institution, but rather as a benefit granted directly through imperial patronage. Later, evidence is similarly indirect. Advocates who represented the interests of the imperial treasury in legal matters are known to have received regular salaries from it. In another example, the satirist Lucian described his position as secretary to the prefect of Egypt, and proudly emphasized that his pay came from the emperor rather than from private sources. Despite these scattered hints, the broader system of salaries, supported by imperial funds, remains unclear. Even seemingly simple references create confusion. A letter from a young sailor serving in the fleet at Misenum tells his father in Egypt that he received travel money in gold coins from Caesar. Yet the costs of maintaining the military were theoretically paid from the normal revenues of the state. The example shows how easily the language of imperial generosity could blur the distinction between the emperor's personal resources and the public finances of the empire. This ambiguity runs through much of the evidence. Even before the distinction between public and imperial funds disappears from the historical record, it is already difficult to draw a firm boundary between them. Income and expenditure were intertwined in ways that cannot always be separated. Nevertheless, one point remains clear. The enormous private wealth controlled by the emperor, along with the many methods used to expand it, played a fundamental role in the structure of imperial rule. Through inheritances, confiscations, and other financial mechanisms, the emperor accumulated resources on a scale unmatched by any other individual. At the same time, he distributed wealth continuously through gifts, rewards, and public generosity. These financial processes had real consequences for the people of the empire. Property rights could be altered through imperial intervention, and legal discussions from the 2nd and 3rd centuries frequently address situations involving the imperial treasury. By the early 4th century, the entire financial structure of the empire was filled with terminology that reflected its origins in the personal wealth of a powerful Roman aristocrat. Expressions referring to the imperial treasury, private financial accounts, patrimonial estates, imperial procurators, military gifts, and later systems of imperial largesse all reveal how deeply these traditions had shaped the administrative language of the empire. In many ways, the transformation was gradual rather than abrupt. The temples built in Rome by Augustus and the vast sums of money he dedicated within them belonged to the same tradition as the churches later constructed by Constantine. Both emperors used immense personal resources to fund religious monuments and adorn them with valuable offerings. The contexts were different, but the underlying pattern remained recognizable. Imperial wealth continued to serve as a powerful instrument through which rulers demonstrated authority, generosity, and legitimacy. Understanding the daily work of an emperor requires looking beyond finances to the practical activities that defined his role. One of the few surviving descriptions of imperial duties comes from a letter written by the orator Cornelius Fronto to Marcus Aurelius. In that letter, he lists the tasks expected of a ruler: proposing measures in the Senate, addressing the Roman people in public gatherings, correcting injustices in the law, sending letters across the world, negotiating with foreign rulers, restraining disorder, and rewarding virtuous conduct. According to Fronto, all these responsibilities depended heavily on the ability to speak and write effectively. For this reason, rhetorical skill was considered essential for an emperor. Fronto reminded Marcus Aurelius that imperial speech should resemble the powerful sound of a trumpet, rather than the delicate tone of a flute. The emperor's words needed strength, clarity, and authority. Earlier writers shared this expectation. Some emperors were admired for their eloquence, while others were criticized when they relied too heavily on the talents of advisors to compose their speeches. From the beginning of the empire, the ability to speak well was treated as a measure of imperial character. Julius Caesar had been celebrated as an orator equal to the greatest speakers of his time. Augustus was praised for a style that suited the dignity of a ruler. Tiberius was known for carefully weighing every word he used. Even emperors whose reputations suffered in other respects were still judged partly by their performance as speakers. Augustus himself had trained extensively in rhetoric and literary studies. He read and wrote constantly, even during periods of military campaigning. Before addressing the Senate or the Roman people, he carefully prepared written speeches. When speaking in Greek, he would first compose the speech in Latin, and then have it translated. The expectation that emperors should produce their own speeches did not disappear easily. Writers often criticized rulers who seemed incapable of speaking without assistance. When Nero delivered a speech written by Seneca, the fact was widely noted. Even so, the tradition persisted that an emperor's public words should reflect his own thought and style. At times, emperors relied on trusted advisors to help draft speeches or official statements. Yet the final performance remained personal. Speeches were delivered before the Senate, before the people of Rome, before the army, and sometimes in provincial cities. The audience judged not only the content, but the confidence, clarity, and dignity of the emperor himself. Written pronouncements were equally important. Imperial decisions could appear in several forms. Formal decrees issued during judicial hearings, general edicts addressed to the public, letters sent to individuals or cities, and short written responses to petitions. Together, these documents formed a central mechanism of imperial authority. Some decisions were clearly personal acts. When the emperor delivered a verdict in court or announced a policy directly, the responsibility was unmistakably his. Even in these cases, however, he often relied on advisors who formed a council of assessors. Their opinions could influence the outcome, though the final judgment remained in imperial hands. The preparation of written documents presents a more complicated picture. Most of this work occurred away from public view, making it difficult to reconstruct exactly how decisions were drafted and recorded. Unlike the speeches of emperors, which could be heard and remembered by many witnesses, the creation of written directives took place within the private environment of the imperial household. The emperor's daily routine also reveals how closely government functions were tied to the rhythms of aristocratic life. One account describes the Emperor Vespasian rising before dawn, reading reports and letters, and meeting friends who came to greet him. After addressing official matters, he would ride, rest, bathe, and dine. Requests and petitions were often presented during moments of relaxation, rather than within a rigid bureaucratic schedule. Another description, written by a senator who personally observed the court of Septimius Severus, portrays a similar pattern. The emperor began work early, discussing government business and hearing legal cases. He continued until midday, then exercised, bathed, and ate, before returning to unfinished matters later in the day. The rhythm combined official duties with leisure in a way that reflected the lifestyle of Rome's aristocracy. In both accounts, the emperor personally read letters and documents sent from across the empire. These might include reports from officials, petitions from private individuals, or requests from communities. Although assistants helped manage the flow of information, the emperor himself remained directly involved in examining important communications. Correspondence, therefore, formed one of the most demanding aspects of imperial rule. Messages arrived from governors, military commanders, cities, and private citizens. Each required attention and often a reply. The volume of communication was immense. This situation had deep historical roots. In the Hellenistic kingdoms that preceded Roman rule in the Eastern Mediterranean, kings regularly received embassies from cities. Delegations presented decrees or petitions in person, and delivered speeches explaining their requests. The ruler would respond verbally and then send an official letter confirming his decision. When Rome expanded into these regions, the same diplomatic customs were adapted to Roman authorities. Roman magistrates and generals began receiving embassies in much the same way as the Hellenistic kings they replaced. The tradition continued under the emperors. Cities sent representatives who carried official decrees and addressed the ruler directly. After hearing the request, the emperor would respond and eventually send a written reply. The delivery of these letters followed familiar patterns from earlier Roman society. Senators of the late Republic had written or dictated their own correspondence, and sent it through personal messengers. The emperors inherited this practice. Letters might be written by the emperor himself or dictated to assistants, and then dispatched by trusted couriers. Some emperors continued to write certain letters entirely in their own hand. Augustus, for example, maintained a lively private correspondence and was known for his interest in language and writing style. Later, rulers occasionally did the same, especially when addressing close friends or issuing messages meant to convey personal goodwill. Most official letters, however, were dictated and prepared with the help of secretaries. Even so, the emperor often reviewed them personally. Contemporary writers sometimes describe emperors reading reports and correspondence early in the morning before beginning other duties. Embassies from cities followed a formal ritual when they appeared before the emperor. An appointed spokesman delivered a speech presenting the request of the community. The delegation then handed over the written decree or petition. The emperor might reply briefly on the spot, though the full response usually arrived later in the form of an official letter. These letters were carried back by the ambassadors and often displayed publicly in their home cities. Some were engraved on stone and placed in prominent locations as lasting records of imperial favour. Disputes brought before the Roman emperor often followed a recognisable pattern. When two embassies disagreed, or when a city confronted a private individual over a grievance, the proceedings resembled a formal hearing. Representatives from each side presented their arguments, sometimes delivering prepared speeches. The emperor listened, occasionally asked questions, and after considering the matter with his advisors, announced a decision. What began as spoken judgment was normally followed by written confirmation sent to the parties involved. One example illustrates the process clearly. A conflict arose over land between two neighbouring communities in Italy during the reign of Domitian. The dispute was presented before the emperor at one of his residences. After hearing the arguments and reviewing the background of the case, he declared his verdict in favour of those already occupying the property. Later, the official letter sent back to the city incorporated the decision he had already pronounced during the hearing. Another case from the eastern provinces shows a similar sequence. Representatives from the Jewish authorities once approached the Emperor Claudius regarding the custody of sacred garments used in religious ceremonies. The emperor informed the ambassadors verbally that their request would be granted. Only afterward did he provide a formal letter confirming the ruling and instructing the provincial governor to implement it. The ambassadors then carried the document back to their homeland as proof of the imperial decision. These examples reveal a consistent pattern. Petitioners, or ambassadors, presented their cases directly before the emperor. He heard the arguments and delivered a decision orally. The written documents that followed were not the decision itself, but rather its official confirmation. Although letters sent to the emperor appear to have reached him personally, the preparation of the emperor's own replies was far more complicated. Several different stages were involved. Determining the content of the response, composing the text in Latin or Greek, and preparing copies for distribution. Roman tradition expected emperors to possess the ability to write their own letters and proclamations. At the same time, they maintained private correspondence like any member of the Roman aristocracy. Some rulers occasionally wrote important messages in their own hand. Tiberius, for example, sometimes sent confidential letters that he trusted to no one else. Nerva wrote personally to Trajan when announcing that he had adopted him as his successor. Trajan himself once addressed the Senate with a letter written entirely by his own hand, though such gestures were unusual and intended to convey special respect. In most circumstances, emperors did not physically write out their official correspondence. Dictation was far more common. A ruler would speak the contents of a message while a secretary recorded the text. This practice appears in several accounts. Titus was said to dictate letters and edicts while assisting his father, Vespasian. Another source describes the Emperor Gaius reading a report from a provincial governor and then dictating a reply to one of the officials responsible for correspondence. Over time, the process could become even more indirect. Rather than dictating every word, an emperor might simply outline the key points and leave the detailed phrasing to his assistants. Even so, he could still intervene in the final version. Some accounts describe rulers adding sentences of their own after the letter had already been drafted. One small but important detail remained closely associated with the emperor himself. Roman letters typically opened with a formal address and ended with a brief closing greeting. The final greeting was often added personally by the emperor as a mark of authenticity. Contemporary writers mention rulers signing off letters while dining with friends or during moments of leisure. Even centuries later, imperial documents still referred to the closing line as written in the emperor's own hand. Even when held indoors, these hearings could remain formal and semi-public events. Representatives from cities, private litigants and witnesses appeared before the emperor. Speeches were delivered, evidence presented, and arguments exchanged. The emperor listened to both sides and sometimes questioned them directly. A notable early example occurred when delegations arrived to discuss the future of Judea after the death of a local ruler. Representatives of different factions presented opposing speeches before Augustus, while members of his advisory circle observed the proceedings. After hearing the arguments, the emperor dismissed the session and later announced his decision. Such hearings often resembled contests in rhetoric. Skilled speakers addressed the emperor directly, attempting to persuade him with carefully constructed arguments. While advisors were present, they rarely spoke during the public proceedings. The emperor himself conducted the questioning and controlled the discussion. The atmosphere could vary widely depending on the ruler's personality. Some emperors behaved with patience and restraint, while others allowed personal preferences or irritation to influence the tone of the hearing. In certain cases, litigants offended the emperor with their appearance or manner of speaking and suffered unfavourable outcomes as a result. Nevertheless, the basic structure remained consistent. The emperor heard the case, consulted his advisors privately if necessary, and then delivered a verdict. That decision was known as a decree. Although it might later be recorded in writing or communicated through official documents, it originated as a spoken judgment pronounced before those present. Even when advisors discussed the case among themselves, their role was purely consultative. The emperor could accept or reject their opinions as he wished. Ultimately, the verdict was always regarded as his personal decision. This constant flow of hearings and judgments reveals how the emperor functioned not only as a political leader, but also as the central source of justice throughout the empire. People from distant provinces travelled long distances to present their disputes before him, convinced that the ruler himself could resolve matters that local authorities could not. In the final days of the Roman Republic, written petitions had already become a familiar way to approach powerful officials. One of the most dramatic moments illustrating this practice occurred on the Ides of March in 44 BC. As Julius Caesar walked toward the Senate, a philosopher named Artemidorus attempted to hand him a written warning revealing the conspiracy against him. Caesar accepted the document but never read it. Surrounded by people presenting other petitions, he carried the paper with him into the Senate House. Moments later, he was assassinated. The small document Artemidorus offered belonged to a category commonly called a libellus. In everyday Roman life, this term could refer to almost any short, written text. Yet when addressed to a magistrate or ruler, it had a more specific meaning. A libellus was essentially a written request, accusation, or petition placed before someone in authority. In Caesar's case, it contained a warning. In later imperial times, similar documents frequently carried complaints, appeals for justice, or requests for favours. Emperors encountered such petitions constantly. Some rulers treated them casually, while others took them extremely seriously. One emperor once refused to accept a document warning him about a potential plot, insisting that he had done nothing that could provoke hatred. Another emperor was killed while reading a document that had just been handed to him, supposedly containing information about a conspiracy. These examples show how dangerous and politically charged these small papers could become. Petitions were not always urgent warnings. Most of the time they were simply requests from individuals hoping to gain imperial attention. Even before the fall of the Republic, people had begun presenting written appeals to powerful officials in hopes of securing protection or privileges. One well-known example comes from Cicero's correspondence. A friend had written a petition asking Caesar to protect certain lands in Greece. Cicero personally handed the request to Caesar while they were dining together. Caesar responded favourably, later confirming the decision through official channels. By Caesar's time, therefore, handing a written petition to a powerful ruler had already become an established practice. The exact origins of this custom are uncertain. Earlier Hellenistic monarchies had similar traditions, where subjects presented written appeals directly to kings. In Egypt, for instance, formal petitions addressed to the Ptolemaic rulers followed set formulas and sometimes received written instructions in response. However, the Roman system eventually developed its own distinctive procedures. One important feature of Roman petitions was the expectation that the ruler himself would read and respond to them. Ancient writers even mention that Caesar occasionally spent time during public events reading and answering documents handed to him. Later, emperors did the same. Some records describe rulers explicitly stating that they had personally read a petition and were persuaded by its arguments. During the early empire, petitions were often handed directly to the emperor during morning audiences. These daily gatherings brought together officials, petitioners, and visitors, hoping for an opportunity to speak with the ruler. In the crowded atmosphere of these receptions, individuals would present their documents in person. Sometimes, dramatic incidents occurred. On one occasion, a man used such a moment to accuse his legal opponent of being an assassin. The emperor immediately ordered the accused man seized and executed. Literary sources describe the crowd pressing forward with complaints and requests, each person hoping to gain a moment of imperial attention. The petitioner might briefly explain the issue verbally, while handing over the written document. In some cases, the emperor responded immediately. In others, the petition was set aside to be examined later. The written petitions themselves had a distinctive style. They did not resemble letters in the usual sense. Instead of beginning with polite greetings or formal introductions, they opened simply with the name of the emperor followed by the name of the petitioner. Their endings were equally brief. The focus was entirely on presenting the request or complaint as clearly as possible. The emperor's reply, however, took on a particular form known as a subscription. The response was usually written directly beneath the original petition. These replies were often extremely short. Sometimes they consisted of only a sentence or two confirming a decision or giving instructions. Evidence from inscriptions, legal texts, and papyri shows that this method became especially common during the 2nd century. Emperors increasingly relied on brief written responses to address the constant flow of petitions arriving from across the empire. The system allowed them to handle a large number of cases efficiently. Administrative records reveal just how frequent these responses could be. In one documented instance during the reign of Septimius Severus, imperial replies were posted publicly over several consecutive days in a major city. Each day's posting contained several responses, often unrelated to one another. If such activity occurred regularly, it would mean that emperors dealt with hundreds of petitions every year. The answers were displayed publicly after being written. Copies of the emperor's responses were posted in prominent locations, where petitioners could read them and confirm the decision. This practice ensured transparency and allowed others facing similar issues to see how the emperor had ruled. Although the emperor was considered personally responsible for these decisions, he did not work alone. A staff of secretaries and advisors assisted in handling the enormous volume of paperwork. Some officials specialized in managing petitions, organizing them, and presenting them to the emperor for review. The exact process behind the scenes remains difficult to reconstruct. In some cases, the emperor may have dictated the reply. In others, he might have simply approved a text prepared by advisors. Yet contemporary sources consistently describe the decision itself as the emperor's own. Legal writers provide interesting glimpses into this process. On one occasion, two emperors explained that they had followed the opinion of a respected jurist when answering a petition. Later discussion among legal experts suggested that a different interpretation might have been better. The episode shows that imperial responses could sometimes be produced quickly, without extended debate, and that later reflection might reveal alternative solutions. Despite the involvement of advisors and legal experts, the imperial reply remained formally a personal act of the ruler. Even when assistants drafted the wording, the authority of the decision rested on the emperor himself. This understanding was shared by legal writers, administrators, and ordinary petitioners alike. The range of issues addressed through petitions was extremely broad. Some dealt with complex legal questions about inheritance or citizenship. Others involved requests for privileges, complaints about officials, or appeals for mercy. Occasionally the subjects were surprisingly mundane. What mattered was the belief that the emperor represented the highest source of justice. People across the empire saw him as someone who could intervene when local authorities failed, or when a situation required extraordinary authority. Even centuries later, this idea remained powerful. During a famous church council in the 4th century, bishops brought written accusations against one another to the emperor. He gathered the documents, listened to their disputes, and then dramatically ordered the papers burned. The gesture symbolized his authority to resolve conflicts and restore unity. Throughout the Roman Empire, the simple act of handing a written petition to the emperor represented more than a bureaucratic procedure. It embodied the expectation that the ruler stood at the center of justice, capable of hearing grievances from any corner of the vast imperial world. Alongside these petitions and replies, emperors occasionally issued broader public announcements known as edicts. Unlike responses to individual petitions, these proclamations addressed the population more generally. An edict did not respond to a specific person. Instead, it declared a rule or instruction intended for a wider audience. In earlier Roman tradition, edicts were literally spoken proclamations. Over time, they became written notices posted in public places. They could deal with many subjects, from administrative reforms to temporary regulations, responding to local circumstances. Some edicts addressed immediate concerns, such as maintaining public order or regulating festivals. Others established rules that remained in effect long after the emperor who issued them had died. Legal writers later quoted such edicts as authoritative statements of law. Despite their importance, edicts appear to have been issued less frequently than individual responses to petitions. Most imperial business seems to have involved reacting to requests or disputes brought before the emperor, rather than announcing sweeping new policies. When edicts were issued, they were usually displayed publicly at the emperor's current residence. Copies might then be distributed to other cities or provinces. In some cases, local authorities were instructed to display them prominently so that everyone could read them. Occasionally, these proclamations were preserved on stone inscriptions. Cities sometimes chose to record edicts permanently if they believed the content was particularly important or beneficial to their community. In many ways, the combination of petitions, written replies, and public edicts formed the communication network between ruler and subjects. Through these channels, individuals, cities, and entire provinces could interact with the highest authority in the Roman world. Behind the grandeur of imperial power lay a surprisingly practical system. Small pieces of writing passed from hand to hand, carried across cities and provinces, and eventually reached the emperor himself. Through these documents, decisions were made, disputes settled, and policies announced. In the Roman world, the emperor was expected to act as the final source of judgment and authority. Yet the way imperial power actually worked was far less centralized and far less bureaucratic than many modern systems. Much of the emperor's work revolved around responding to requests rather than initiating policies. Evidence from inscriptions, letters, and administrative records suggests that the emperor's office functioned largely as a place where appeals, petitions, and disputes were brought for decision. The emperor was not surrounded by a permanent government administration in the modern sense. Instead, he relied on a small group of advisors, secretaries, freedmen, and trusted companions who travelled with him and assisted in handling the constant flow of communications from across the empire. Among the most important tools used in this process were official records known as commentarii. The word itself could refer to many kinds of notes or records, but in the imperial context it usually meant written documentation of earlier decisions made by the emperor or his predecessors. These records might contain details of legal judgments, grants of privileges, or decisions involving cities and individuals. They formed a kind of memory for the imperial government, preserving the precedents that could guide future decisions. In many cases, they recorded acts of favour, such as the granting of Roman citizenship or other legal rights. Over time, these records must have grown to enormous size, since thousands of petitions from across the empire were directed to the emperor every year. One surviving example reveals how formal these records could be. In a document recording the grant of Roman citizenship to the family of a tribal leader in North Africa, the entry lists the names and ages of the individuals involved, the circumstances of the request, and the imperial approval of the decision. The document also includes official confirmation that it had been copied and checked from the imperial records. This shows that the imperial archives were not merely informal notes, but carefully maintained documents intended to serve as legal proof in the future. They could be consulted whenever disputes arose about rights or privileges granted by the emperor. Yet these records also raise practical questions about how the imperial administration actually functioned. Emperors spent long periods travelling through the provinces or campaigning on distant frontiers. If the archives were extensive, transporting them across the empire would have been difficult and risky. On the other hand, leaving them behind in Rome would have limited the emperor's ability to consult earlier decisions. The historical evidence does not clearly explain how this problem was solved. What can be seen, however, is that emperors frequently travelled with at least some documents and secretaries, who managed the most recent records and correspondence. In addition to the commentarii, There were other types of records connected with imperial decisions. Documents relating to land assignments, colonial foundations, and public resources were preserved in imperial archives as well. These records were important because they provided evidence in later disputes over boundaries, rights, or privileges. Land surveyors and officials sometimes referred to these archives when conflicts arose, suggesting that they functioned as a central reference point for the legal acts of the emperor. Despite the existence of such records, the emperor's government did not operate like a modern administrative state. The available evidence suggests that most imperial documents recorded decisions that had already been made in response to petitions. Cities, provincial communities, and private individuals frequently sent representatives to the emperor to present requests or complaints. These embassies could travel great distances to reach him. Individuals also submitted written petitions seeking justice, favours, or clarification of laws. The emperor's court therefore functioned as a place where appeals were heard and answered, rather than as a centre where policies were constantly being planned. The emperor's advisors also reflected this pattern. Augustus had once attempted to organise a formal council of senators who would assist in decision-making. But this arrangement did not last. Over time, the system evolved into a more informal group of advisors drawn from trusted associates, legal experts, and officials. Many of the emperor's secretaries held specialised roles, managing correspondence, petitions, or financial records. Their duties included drafting responses, preparing documents, and recording decisions. Even so, the final judgment was expected to come directly from the emperor himself. Daily routines also limited how much the emperor could accomplish. In Roman aristocratic culture, official business was usually conducted only during the morning hours. The emperor's time was therefore divided between hearings, meetings with advisors, and audiences with petitioners. Travel further complicated matters. When the emperor moved between cities or military camps, the administrative resources available to him were only those that accompanied him. Communication across the empire could take weeks or months, which meant that many decisions required patience and careful handling. For this reason, the emperor's role was often reactive rather than proactive. Major reforms certainly occurred at times, especially during the reign of Augustus and later, during periods of administrative reorganization. But the everyday operation of imperial rule was built around answering questions, settling disputes, and responding to the requests of subjects. The emperor stood at the center of a vast network of communication that linked distant communities with the highest authority of the state. This expectation that the emperor would listen to his subjects became deeply rooted in Roman political culture. Cities sent delegations to present speeches before him. Individuals appealed directly to him for justice. Even minor complaints or personal matters could be brought before the imperial court. The system depended not only on the authority of the emperor, but also on the shared belief that he was responsible for hearing the concerns of his people and providing fair decisions. A later historian writing about Marcus Aurelius captured this ideal clearly. In his account, Marcus appears as the model of a just ruler, respected for both his learning and his character. He was deeply devoted to philosophy and literature, and his writings reflected the intellectual traditions of the Greek and Roman world. Yet what impressed observers most was his behaviour toward those who approached him. Petitioners were not turned away or treated with contempt. Instead, Marcus listened patiently and ensured that the guards around him did not push people aside. In this image of the emperor receiving those who sought his judgment, the central principle of Roman imperial rule becomes visible. The ruler was expected to hear, to judge, and to respond. Daily routines also limited how much the emperor could accomplish. In Roman aristocratic culture, official business was usually conducted only during the morning hours. The emperor's time was therefore divided between hearings, meetings with advisors, and audiences with petitioners. Travel further complicated matters. When the emperor moved between cities or military camps, the administrative resources available to him were only those that accompanied him. Communication across the empire could take weeks or months, which meant that many decisions required patience and careful handling. For this reason, the emperor's role was often reactive rather than proactive. Major reforms certainly occurred at times, especially during the reign of Augustus and later, during periods of administrative reorganization. But the everyday operation of imperial rule was built around answering questions, settling disputes, and responding to the requests of subjects. The emperor stood at the center of a vast network of communication that linked distant communities with the highest authority of the state. This expectation that the emperor would listen to his subjects became deeply rooted in Roman political culture. Cities sent delegations to present speeches before him. Individuals appealed directly to him for justice. Even minor complaints or personal matters could be brought before the imperial court. The system depended not only on the authority of the emperor, but also on the shared belief that he was responsible for hearing the concerns of his people and providing fair decisions. A later historian writing about Marcus Aurelius captured this ideal clearly. In his account, Marcus appears as the model of a just ruler, respected for both his learning and his character. He was deeply devoted to philosophy and literature, and his writings reflected the intellectual traditions of the Greek and Roman world. Yet what impressed observers most was his behavior toward those who approached him. Petitioners were not turned away or treated with contempt. Instead, Marcus listened patiently and ensured that the guards around him did not push people aside. In this image of the emperor receiving those who sought his judgment, the central principle of Roman imperial rule becomes visible. The ruler was expected to hear, to judge, and to respond.